We now come to the general debate on Ukraine. I call the Minister to move the motion. Minister Stephen Doughty.
Well, thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I beg to move the motion in our name. Next month marks 4 years since Russia launched its illegal and barbarous full-scale invasion of Ukraine. But Ukraine has stood strong, and we have stood alongside them and will continue to do so. And I am particularly proud that this week also marks 1 year on from our agreement of a crucial 100-year partnership with Ukraine that I know enjoys wide support across the House and that we will be celebrating and taking further forward this week. But this is 4 years, Madam Deputy Speaker, in which the Ukrainian people have stood firm, bravely resisting this assault on their sovereign territory. 4 years of enduring relentless drone and missile strikes that have killed civilians and have torn through homes, infrastructure, hospitals and schools. And like many members across this House, I have been in Kyiv while those attacks have been underway. I've seen the devastation, the damage caused. I've seen the implications for the civilians, the ordinary people of Ukraine who are facing this. I've been in the bunkers where children have to take their lessons because of the attacks. And I've heard the harrowing stories of those who've been abducted and taken by barbarous and illegal Russian action. And just last week, Russia launched 252 drones and 36 missiles at targets across Ukraine. Yet another attack that killed and injured dozens of civilians and left millions without power or heating as temperatures plunged to minus 20 degrees. The attack also included an Oreshnik intermediate-range ballistic missile that struck critical infrastructure near the Polish border. And Russia's use, for the second time, of a hypersonic IRBM in Ukraine, this time close to NATO territory, is a reckless and dangerous escalation. Moscow claims it was responding to an alleged Ukrainian attack on one of Putin's residences, an absolutely baseless allegation, and yet another example of Russia using disinformation to justify its actions. And disinformation is an issue which I was discussing just last week in the Foreign Affairs Committee with members, and an issue which I know many of us take deeply seriously across this House. And I would, as an aside, Madam Deputy Speaker, note the absence yet again of one party in this House. Again, I think we all note that because I think there is a very strong cross-party consensus on this, but there's one party that's missing. And of course, that's a party that has willingly repeated Russian narratives on NATO and on Ukraine, and indeed whose former leader in Wales took bribes from Russia to share their narratives. And they might like this to go away, Madam Deputy Speaker, but it's not just their words, their absence speaks volumes too. And I therefore, and I genuinely do, commend the opposition and indeed the other parties that are present here today, because I think all of us in this House, and I've had many conversations with the members here on many occasions, have stood resolutely, whichever side of the House we've been on, with Ukraine since the start of this conflict. And that very much, I think, represents where the British people are, where British people stand in relation to this illegal and barbarous aggression in our continent. We know too from our own history what that can mean, and we will continue to stand. And I'm proud of the constituency, my own constituency, and indeed in all of our constituencies, who continue to support Ukrainians here in the UK and continue to stand with Ukraine in their fight against Russia. And of course, Madam Deputy Speaker, Russia's barbaric actions come against the backdrop of US-led peace negotiations. Time and again, Ukraine has shown that it is the party of peace. And just last week, President Zelensky came together with world leaders and the United States in Paris to discuss next steps. And we welcome the significant progress that has been made and the work of President Trump and many others in taking that forward. And alongside France, the UK has led the coalition of the willing, carrying out detailed military planning on the security guarantees which are needed to ensure against future Russian aggression in the event of a peace settlement. And in Paris, at the largest meeting yet of the coalition, my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, joined President Macron and President Zelensky to sign a declaration of intent. And that declaration confirms that in the event of a peace deal, the UK and France would deploy forces to Ukraine. It paves the way for a legal framework under which British, French and partner forces could operate on Ukrainian soil, securing its skies and its seas and regenerating its armed forces for the future. And as my honourable friend the Prime Minister has said, if British troops were to deploy under this agreement, the matter would come before this House for a debate and a vote. And the Paris Declaration, agreed with US and coalition partners, sets out the security guarantees to be activated once a ceasefire takes effect. I can see, I'll happily give way.
And I've previously suggested that to have an occupied eastern part of Ukraine under Russian control, whilst the western part of unoccupied Ukraine were left as a military vacuum, would be a recipe for disaster. However, it is of concern that the alliance that stood firm at the end of World War II to ensure that West Germany did not get encroached upon by Soviet forces from the east is not still in being as far as Ukraine is concerned because of the ambiguous attitude of President Trump. Has the Minister a view on why President Trump is so clear when it comes to dictatorship and aggression by Iran, and yet has such a strangely different view when it applies to the same two features of Russian behaviour?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, I have huge respect for the right honourable gentleman, as he knows. I would gently disagree with his suggestion. I think President Trump's leadership and indeed the very important discussions that took place in Paris with the United States and indeed other coalition partners sets out very clearly how security guarantees would be activated, and there have been very important steps taken. And of course, more broadly, I am proud that we continue to stand with the United States in NATO. Our commitment to Article 5, our commitment to defending the security of the alliance is absolutely crucial to our security, indeed all of us in the alliance. We, of course, support all the progress towards a just and lasting peace, but it is crucial, Madam Deputy Speaker, that we keep Ukraine in the fight. We all know that its armed forces are fighting heroically and with great determination, and indeed I, like many of you, will have met those who have served on the front lines in Ukraine and the extraordinary bravery and fortitude that they show. But of course we must recognise they are under immense pressure, and therefore we need to get them the support that they need to defend themselves and of course ensure they have support into the future. I'll happily give way.
Thank you. I thank the Minister for giving way. Today the NATO Parliamentary Assembly have been given an open letter from the chairman of the Ukrainian Parliament, who's been here, Russian Stefanchuk, who I've met a few times. He's urging for immediate delivery of air defence and air-to-air missiles. They are in desperate need of it. He's asked all NATO members to speed this delivery up as fast as possible.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, I thank the honourable and gallant gentleman for his comments on this and for sharing what the Speaker of the Rada has said. I've too met with him in the past, and he's a remarkable individual, as indeed are all of those Ukrainian MPs who we've all met, who stood to defend their parliament at the most difficult times back at the time of the original invasion. But he raises important points. These are all matters which the Secretary of State for Defence and my colleague to my left and others are looking at. We are looking very much at all of the immediate needs, and of course we stand ready to support Ukraine wherever we can. And indeed, that is why we have led the 50-nation Ukraine Defence Contact Group alongside Germany. We secured 50 billion in military aid pledges last year, and why we're also going further. We've developed an advanced air defence interceptor drone, Project Octopus, to be mass-produced in the UK. We're also developing a new long-range ballistic missile to boost Ukraine's firepower and defend against Putin's war machine, and also why we continue to lead not only in supporting Ukraine ourselves, but also in galvanising other partners to maintain that support. I was meeting with my good colleague from Portugal this morning, discussing the contribution Portugal has made, and indeed many countries, large and small across Europe, have stepped up. And I think it's important to acknowledge, Madam Deputy Speaker, that European partners increased aid by more than 50% in 2025 compared with the year before. And indeed in December, as colleagues will know, the European Council agreed a €90 billion loan to help meet Ukraine's needs, and we of course are also providing up to €4.1 billion in support through a World Bank loan guarantee that runs until 2027. But of course it's not just the support that we need to provide Ukraine militarily now and into the future so that they can defend against and deter against future threats in the event of a settlement, but we must also ratchet up the pressure on Putin to de-escalate the war and engage in meaningful negotiations and come to the table. This government, I am proud to say, has sanctioned over 900 individuals, entities and ships under the UK's Russia sanctions regime, including Russia's largest oil companies and 520 oil tankers. And last week, as colleagues will know, the UK supported the United States in intercepting the sanctioned vessel Bella 1 in the North Atlantic as it's made its way to Russia. And we are working with international partners on further measures to tackle the shadow fleet. These include additional sanctions, steps to discourage third countries from engaging with the fleet, increased information sharing, and readiness to use regulatory and interdiction powers. By choking off Russia's oil revenues and squeezing its war economy, we are showing Putin he cannot outlast us. Our sanctions are biting hard. There is clear evidence for their impact. Russia's oil export revenues are at a 4-year low, and we are preparing to implement further significant sanctions this year, which have been announced, including bans on importing refined oil of Russian origin and a maritime service ban on Russian liquefied natural gas, which I know a number of members have rightly called for over the past months. And as a result of our actions and those of our partners, Russia's economy is now in its worst position since the full-scale invasion began. And we are also taking crucial steps to stop the third country circumvention of sanctions, and whether that is intercepting crypto networks that are flooding resource into Russia, whether it's components and others on critical lists that they might be using in drones, whether it's in those energy revenues that they're generating. We will not cease till we find every way in which Putin is attempting to circumvent our regimes. And I'm proud to work closely with colleagues across government on this in different departments, but also crucially with European, United States and other partners. It is having a tangible impact, and it is as crucial as the direct support that we provide. I will happily give way.
Grateful to the right honourable gentleman, and I agree with him that the foreign exchange earnings of the Russian economy have been very badly damaged by the sanctions. But we also are now coming to the conclusion, are we not, that it is legal for Western powers to intervene on the fake flag fleet, the shadow fleet, as we saw last week. What plans have the government got, and of our allies, to make the whole business of exporting Russian oil and gas far more risky than it already is by a large-scale interception of the shadow fleet?
Well, he will note I chose my words carefully about future actions. I'm obviously not going to go into specifics, but let me just say this. We know what Putin is doing, we know where he's taking things, and we know what is happening, and we won't hesitate to act lawfully where we can to choke off those revenues that are going through to fuel that war against Ukraine. And let's remember that's exactly what it is doing. So let that be a warning, because we will not hesitate to use the powers that we have, of course, lawfully, wherever we can. I'll happily give way again.
I do thank for the second intervention. I was recently on a trip to South Korea, cross-party with NATO in December, where we heard across government they have changed their position on Russia, and they are now looking to open plants in Russia, and they spouted the NATO line, the Russian lines against NATO. I have fed this into government, but we have recently signed a huge trade deal with South Korea. Is this a concern within government of people we're trading with are now shifting position on Russia?
Well, look, we continue to work with all partners around the world and engage with them and make sure that the reality of any loopholes, any routes that could be supporting that war. Of course, I would note, as we all know, that of course DPRK troops were brought in by Russia to fight, and of course we continue to work with all partners to identify ways. And of course, often there are entities and individuals operating within countries, and we try and bring those to the attention of the authorities in partners and friends. To take action, but if necessary we won't hesitate to sanction and take actions where appropriate. I would turn, Madam Deputy Speaker, also to crucially the issue of accountability, because we are working closely with Ukraine and its allies to hold Russia accountable for its heinous crimes in Ukraine. We are a founding member and chair of the Conference of Participants of the Register of Damage, which allows Ukrainians to record losses, injury or damage caused by the war. And in December, I was proud to visit The Hague to sign the convention on behalf of the UK to establish an international claims commission, which will assess claims under the Register of Damage to determine future compensation. We're also supporting the Office of the Prosecutor General of Ukraine and indeed the International Criminal Court to ensure that allegations of war crimes are fully and fairly investigated by independent and robust legal mechanisms. Of course, we also know, and I mentioned this, Madam Deputy Speaker, that tens of thousands of boys and girls have been snatched from their families, deported and indoctrinated by Russia. We are clear this is a campaign to erase a nation's future. We cannot allow that to happen. So we are backing efforts, crucial efforts, to bring those children home, to identify them and to work with other partners in that regard. And we've committed more than 2.8 million to help trace and return them, and welcome all that colleagues have been doing on this issue to raise that awareness globally. I'll happily give way.
Thank you. I thank the Minister for giving way. Last year, I moved my constituency office into a building called Bosnia House. Bosnia House was a former police station taken over by Anis Kerik and his organisation, who's the CEO for the Bosnia UK network. They support all communities, including Ukrainians, Syrians and Bosnians. My appeal is that we've got such facilities that are operating not only in my constituency but across the country, and more support and help needs to be provided so we make sure that the Ukrainians that come to settle into this country are fully supported and helped, because not only are they given the help and support to integrate, but with the how they can achieve a better life in this country, but also integrate with the other communities that also exist. So any support and help that can be done in terms of sanctions and the money that can be drawn upon that would be most gratefully if they can be specifically targeted to these individuals, organisations, so they can help the organisations.
Well, I thank Honourable Friend for making that point, and he's right to point to the contribution of so many different organisations across the country that have reached out to support Ukrainian communities. I've certainly seen that in Cardiff directly, some fantastic groups who've done so, and I know that's reflected indeed in his constituency too. And I think actually there is a strong heritage in this country of organisations and individuals who previously themselves fled conflict, working to support others who've done the same, and I've seen that repeatedly through many different groups. So I pay tribute to all of them, and indeed I pay tribute to all of the people up and down Britain who brought in Ukrainians to their homes and have supported efforts in many other ways. I'll happily give way.
I thank the Minister for giving way. Whilst we're on the subject of Russian war crimes, we obviously know that James Scott Rees-Anderson was one of the only Britons to have been captured by the Russians. He was tried, and I know that the Foreign Office believes that was on false charges. He was charged with being part of a terrorist group and illegally entering Russia, was sentenced to his first 5 years in a Russian prison, and then would be transferred to a Russian penal colony rather than being treated under the Geneva Convention. I wonder if the Minister could give an update on what progress has been made in securing his release.
Minister.
Well, I can assure him, as he's aware, we are well aware of the number of cases. Of course, Russia has obligations under the Geneva Conventions. We expect those to be upheld. We regularly raise these cases at the appropriate levels. I'm happy to talk to him separately about the specific case that he mentions, but he can be assured that I'm well aware of it, as I am of a number of the other cases. But we're very clear that international law must be upheld, and these are the basic principles of treatment of prisoners of war, of that situation involving children, which I think actually also get to the heart of just the nature of what the Russian regime has been doing and the steps that which they're willing to go to. So we urge the upholding of those commitments that we're all signed up to, of basic decency and treatment of individuals. We, of course, are also standing with Ukrainian people on the ground in their hour of need. We've provided more than 577 million in humanitarian support for vulnerable citizens since the invasion began, including those forced to flee their homes. And this year, we will spend up to 100 million on this support, including helping families through this harsh winter. And we've upped our support when it comes to energy, and particularly in response to the attacks that we're seeing regularly. A lot of the work we're doing is helping mitigate, but of course the scale of those attacks on energy infrastructure are severe, and they're having a daily impact, as you can see from the media reporting and of course from what we know from the ground. We have no firmer friend for Ukraine than the UK, and indeed our commitment runs deep. And I mentioned the crucial 100-year partnership that the Prime Minister signed with President Zelensky in Kiev, and that's an agreement that has enhanced cooperation across defence and security, science, trade and culture, and I'll happily give way.
Could I thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Could I thank the Minister for his update, and in particular for the in-depth overview that he's giving us this afternoon. Further to the point from my honourable friend from Birmingham, I would appreciate an update on the work that he's doing to support families in this country. Could I commend the work of the Ukrainian Community Centre in Reading to him, where there is a Ukrainian language library. It's one of a very few in the south of England. We have visitors coming from West London and Oxford to use it. It's very important for families to be able to maintain their native language and for children to retain their culture at this very difficult time. And I wondered if you wanted to say a few words about the importance of that form of domestic support.
My honourable friend makes a hugely important point, and indeed a similar initiative in my own constituency I've seen of a Ukrainian language library, and I think it is absolutely crucial that that support is given, not only because it's the right thing to do for those young people and enables them to retain that connection with their culture, their heritage, their language, but also because, again, it stands in stark contrast to the attempts by Putin to wipe out that language, that culture, that history, that heritage that he's showing, not only by the abduction of children, by these continued attacks. And I think one of my most moving moments for me on one of my visits to Kiev was being in a bunker under one of the schools and just seeing the remarkable fortitude and resilience of young people and their teachers in the face of that attempt of Russia, not only to physically destroy their lives, but also to attempt to psychologically destroy their lives. But they stand firm and resilient just as other Ukrainians do, and I think that should be a lesson to all of us. And of course, that's why under the 100-year partnership we also have, as well as joint development of drone and defence technology and looking at trading links and digital connection and other matters, we also have important school twinning programmes. And all of those things collectively, I think, will deliver long-term economic growth and security for both the UK and Ukraine and strengthen ties between our nations. So let me finish, Madam Deputy Speaker, because I know there are many contributions that members want to make, by saying this. The UK's support for Ukraine is ironclad. Their security is our security. We fully support US-led efforts to secure a just and lasting peace. We've also said repeatedly only the Ukrainian people can decide their future. We remain committed to the principle that international borders must never be changed by force, and any deal must guarantee Ukraine's sovereignty and security into the future, and indeed Europe's and indeed the United Kingdom's security into the future. And in the meantime, we will not hesitate to keep supporting Ukraine, ensure it has the military equipment to defend itself, sustain that economic pressure on Putin to cut off the revenues funding that barbaric war, and to ensure accountability for the appalling scenes of destruction and devastation that we have seen, whether those are on children, whether those are on infrastructure, whether those are against the whole nation of Ukraine itself. Slava Ukraini.
The question is that this House has considered the situation in Ukraine. I call the Shadow Minister, Andrew Rosindell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We are at a crucial juncture in this conflict, and the stakes could not be higher. It has been nearly 4 years since Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine, a period of time nearly that of the duration of the First World War, with many of those same horrors that our soldiers witnessed in those days. Trench warfare, a war of attrition, being witnessed today by a generation of young Ukrainians and Russians who are being decimated in their hundreds of thousands. We have also tragically seen the horrific mass deportation of 20,000 Ukrainian children. Madam Deputy Speaker, this is nothing short of a war crime. Make no mistake, on the line is sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. The freedom and democracy enjoyed by its people, and also the entire security architecture of the West is at stake. The threat is especially acute in the eastern flank for countries like Moldova and in the Black Sea, but this reaches far beyond the region. It is, Madam Deputy Speaker, about the security of all of us. European countries are already having to protect their borders from malign Russian activity. We have had to do so for years and will continue to do so. But 2025, I felt, looked like a real turning point. Just look at what has been happening in Poland. Whether that's Russian drones, incursions or railway sabotage, Romania and Estonia have both had their airspace outrageously violated by Russia, and the Royal Navy has had to be activated to intercept Russian ships, including Yantar, and we all know the real purpose of that ship. Russia is already waging a sophisticated, hybrid and subconventional campaign against us. The reality is that we must be prepared for sustained tension with Russia for many years to come. But the outcome of the war in Ukraine is central to whether that threat is checked or emboldened. And this extends beyond that of just Russia. The fact that Putin is now reliant on North Korean personnel and ammunition should shame him, but it should also warn us. The war has become a testing ground for an authoritarian axis that will not stop at Ukraine if it is allowed to succeed. And so, Madam Deputy Speaker, all of us want to see this war end. It is unjust, unprovoked, and entirely of Putin's making. It is therefore of no surprise that Putin appears completely insincere about wanting to reach a genuine ceasefire. We understand that initiatives to end this war, led by the United States of America, are progressing, at least on the Ukrainian side, and it would be helpful to hear from the Minister in the wind-up his latest assessment of those talks and their direction of travel. It is also important to recognise where responsibility lies. Time and again, Ukraine has showed a willingness to engage in discussions aimed at ending the conflict. Russia, by contrast, has repeatedly demonstrated a lack of seriousness and sincerity. If ceasefire proposals are rejected or negotiations undermined, the obstacle to peace lies not in Kyiv nor among Ukraine's friend, but, Madam Deputy Speaker, firmly in Moscow. One principle must remain non-negotiable, that the Ukrainian people must be sovereign in their own land. They have paid in blood to defend themselves and their homeland, and decisions about their future, their borders and their security arrangements must be made by Ukraine and Ukraine alone. No peace imposed from outside will endure, and no settlement that ignores the will of the Ukrainian people can be sustainable. And as we have done throughout history, Britain must continue to show international leadership in defending that principle. And so I would welcome an update from the Minister on what the UK is doing diplomatically to that end. What is crucial is that we achieve a just and lasting peace. Putin cannot emerge strengthened from a potential settlement. We cannot give in to him, because the lesson of the last 20 years is that he always comes back for more, with a persistent desire to exert control over neighbouring states and to challenge the post-Cold War settlement in Europe. And it is clear that he has, in the KGB playbook, out right now with the statecraft he is using, Putin has not abandoned his territorial ambitions. He wants to subjugate Ukraine, lock, stock and barrel. And so, Madam Deputy Speaker, a lasting peace is not about conceding to aggression. Territorial concessions would mean rewarding Putin's barbaric attacks on the Ukrainian people. Britain must lead the way again on sanctions and keep tightening the screws on Putin's war machine. Moscow should be denied safe harbours for its tankers and profits, and the EU should step up and ban Russian oil and gas sooner than it currently plans to do in 2027. So, can the Minister confirm whether he has been pressing his EU counterparts in the European Union and European capitals to do exactly that? The Atlantic Alliance must lead a new pincer movement to further constrain Russia's energy revenues and stop Putin getting his hands on military equipment. The issue with Russian oil persists. Countries are allowing the purchase and whitewashing of Russian oil on their watch. We know the businesses, refineries and individuals who are profiting from Russian energy exports. So, does the government plan to take further action against those enablers? On sovereign Russian assets, it is clear we need to go a lot further. We welcome the £2.26 billion loan made by the UK to Ukraine off the back of the profits from immobilised Russian sovereign assets. But the government cannot view this as the end of the road. Instead, ministers need to be working around the clock, including with the City of London and our allies, to find innovative and workable legal solutions that allow us to go even further and drive other G7 and European states to do the same. So, what is the current status of talks with the EU, the United States and the G7 partners? And specifically, what recent discussions has the Minister had with his Belgian counterpart? What is the UK doing to help move things along? And does the Minister agree that when those sanctioned assets are mobilised, they should not be just for the reconstruction of Ukraine, but also to support the Ukrainian people as fast as possible? And so, Madam Deputy Speaker, for all the talk of negotiations, we must not lose sight of the fact that we and our allies combined GDP colossally outweighs Russia's, and that we need to be leveraging this in every right way. We need to ramp up our defence industrial base now for the long term, because we know that Russia, sustaining its war economy, will come at an enormous price to them, whilst it is already reeling from sanctions with interest rates at high levels, not seen in decades, and with welfare payments having to be slashed in Russia. Last week we learned that the government's vision for British troops on the ground in Ukraine should happen if a peace agreement is agreed. So this deployment of British troops is, I believe, one of the most serious decisions a government and a parliament could ever take. So there are a number of vital details that I believe we need to understand about what exactly the government plans are for any future deployment. These include the rules of engagement, troop numbers, how rotations could work, the composition of the force, whether any British soldiers will be actively involved in policing and patrolling of any border or demilitarised zone, and what air and naval assets would be provided as part of any multinational force for Ukraine. The British people will expect answers to these vital questions before we consider sending our boys out to a conflict zone, potentially risking the lives of courageous British servicemen and women. The government must also confirm the contributions of other countries and the nature of any security guarantees, particularly with regard to the United States and indeed Germany. We also need ministers to confirm whether soldiers operating in Ukraine will be subject to the European Convention on Human Rights during any deployment. I would also be grateful if the Minister could clarify which government budget such operation will be funded from, and does he agree that this underscores the imperative of spending 3% of GDP on defence by the end of this Parliament? Her Majesty's opposition have called for this, and I hope the government will do the same. Kicking the can into the next decade with no roadmap is simply not going to cut it in the world we currently live in. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, we must do everything in our power to deter another invasion of this kind to any other country. And in principle, Britain must be involved in any and every effort to provide deterrence against such aggression in the future. But two things are also critical in the immediate term. First, that Ukraine continues to receive the military aid it needs to fight back against Russia's increasingly savage war, and that Putin's ability to wage this war is further undermined, for example, through biting new sanctions. Second, that any initiatives to secure an end to the conflict deliver peace on the terms of the Ukrainian people and with the involvement of Ukraine. We cannot allow Putin to be strengthened. And so can the Minister also provide an update on how the UK is ensuring Ukraine is able to meet the increasingly savage tactics being used by Russia? And so to conclude, Madam Deputy Speaker, in the early days of the war, the previous Conservative government played a pivotal role in coming to the aid of the Ukrainian people. Just as Margaret Thatcher stood up to the threat of Soviet domination in Eastern Europe and fought for their freedom and their democracy, ultimately leading to the fall of the Berlin Wall and the breakup of the Soviet Union, my party led at the outset of this invasion and continues to stand with the Ukrainian people. As usual, Madam Deputy Speaker, it was British leadership that set the direction of travel for many European countries. It was the British people who provided approximately £12 billion in overall support, including military and humanitarian aid. And with our allies, it was Britain that imposed the largest and most severe set of sanctions that Russia had ever seen to cripple Putin's war machine. It was indeed Britain that hosted the Ukraine Recovery Conference in 2023, raising billions for Ukraine's recovery and reconstruction. And it was Britain that established Operation Interflux, which has now trained over 50,000 Ukrainian recruits on British soil since the illegal invasion of 2022. When freedom is threatened, Britain stands resolute. Today, we feel as passionately as we did 4 years ago about defending and restoring the freedom that the Ukrainian people earned back in 1991. Long has Britain stood for the cause of freedom, and long may that continue.
Dame Emily Thornberry. Thank you very much.
I've been complaining at home recently because the heating broke down and I just felt as it wasn't being taken seriously by the other half. And it was -1, I was really cold and I had been moaning about it for a week. And then it was pointed out to me the obvious, which is right now in Ukraine, in Kyiv, it's -12. It feels like -16 and overnight it will be. In fact, it'll be -17. And what I've now done on my phone to stop myself moaning is I have London's temperature, but I also have Kyiv's. And I just keep remembering that actually in Kyiv there are ordinary men and women who are having to battle against the cold and their infrastructure is being deliberately attacked by Putin in order to try to undermine their morale. What happened on Monday night? On Monday night, there were 293 drones and 18 missiles in a bombardment. Air defences shot down 240 and 7 missiles, but there was damage to critical infrastructure, civilian infrastructure in Kyiv, across Zaporizhzhia, Odessa, Sumy, Kharkov and Donetsk. There are several 100,000 households without any power now, without any heating. There are tower blocks, 500 high-rise tower blocks, where they're really cold. They have acute shortages of electricity, and they're doing it on purpose. The Russians are doing it on purpose. Yeah. And this is not proper warfare. You are not, you just feel this is such a basic thing. You are not supposed to target civilians when you are at war. It is against the law. When you are at war, you are at war. Go for the combatants. Don't go for the children. Don't go for the nursery schools. Don't go for the housing estates. Don't bomb blocks of flats. This is not right. It is not proper. It is illegal. It is immoral. It is wrong. The effect on the people, though, is, and of course they're exhausted. They're about to hit the 4th year of being at war with Russia. But what is so amazing and what has absolutely hit me in the heart when I've talked to Ukrainians is the strength, the focus, the fortitude, the bravery of these people. How they are absolutely determined to keep their country Ukrainian, and they are not going to allow the Russians to win, no matter how hard it is, no matter how cold it is, no matter how many people are lost. They are going to continue to fight, and they stand resolute. And we stand with Ukraine. We stand with Ukraine. We stand with these brave people. We have had in the Foreign Affairs Committee the honour of not only visiting Ukraine, but also of having a number of meetings with the Ukrainian Foreign Affairs Committee. And they varied over the years. And the most recent one, only the chair, only the chair was the only person we could see. The other people, I sort of joked about it to start with. I was going, oh, they ought to turn the lights on. Oh, what an idiot. They don't have any lights. They don't have any lights, they don't have any power. What they were doing was they were talking to us from their cars, because they could put the heating on the car and then they could put on a light in their car and they could talk to us that way. And that was how we had a meeting with the Foreign Affairs Committee. But they showed up and they told us what they had to say. We stand with Ukraine. This bravery. And there are many things that we can do. So I'm really encouraged to hear that we are really bolstering the work that we need to do when it comes to the shadow fleet. I mean, if anybody doesn't understand, the shadow fleet is this. They are a fleet of ageing ships, of obscure ownership, who are uninsured and often environmentally unsound, and they are being used to transport sanctioned Russian oil products in order to be able to get around the oil price cap. And, I mean, I hope that what we will find is that we are able to find legal grounds for deploying military assets against the shadow fleets under the Sanctions and Money Laundering Act, and we will be able to do insurance spot checks on false flag ships. False flag ships are ships, some of which have been expelled by the countries that they use to wave a flag and claim they come from that country. Some of these countries don't even have a shipping register, and yet they still claim that they belong to those. But if they're not insured, we can really take action, and I'm glad to hear that we are going to step that up. That sort of sanction busting has got to stop.
On that point, will the round roll...
Of course I will. Right.
I thank my right honourable friend for giving way. On the topic of the shadow fleet, just earlier today, 2 shadow tankers from the fleet were scheduled to be going through the Channel. And the shadow fleet exists solely to keep money flowing to the Kremlin, threatening also maritime safety and environmental security. So does my right honourable friend agree with me that there are also other aspects that are relevant to this debate that the UK government should be mindful of as we continue to pursue the shadow fleet that allows Putin to wage his unwarranted, unlawful invasion of Ukraine?
Yeah, I mean, I agree completely, and I think we need to be as creative as we possibly can when it comes to this, and I think there is always more that we can do, and the Foreign Affairs Committee and many of the talented members on it are always here to give as many suggestions as the government wishes to hear. But one of the things that does worry me when it comes to sanctions, given that it's all very well having creative ways in which we can put down sanctions, but they are only as good as their enforcement. And I am concerned at times when pushing the government on exactly how much effort they're putting into enforcement and how much investment is going into enforcement. My concern is that although they may sometimes look good on paper, I am always concerned that there may be things that are slipping through the net, and we need to make sure that what we say, we mean, and we do it. Let me move on briefly to a couple of other issues that I would like to cover. The first is that of course, although there is a hot war going on in Ukraine, and that is one war which is going on in Europe, we are all agreed that Europe is also at war with Russia on another basis, and that is the new warfare, the hybrid warfare, the sort of warfare that is more difficult to be able to identify, and whether that's sabotage, or whether they are subjecting us to cyber attacks or to mis and disinformation. We are at war with Russia, and they are trying to undermine our democracies and undermine our countries, and nowhere as clearly as around the Black Sea. We're around the Black Sea, which is, of course, of huge strategic importance to Russia. And if you think about the countries around the Black Sea, Bulgaria, Romania, Moldova, Ukraine, Georgia, they have all been subjected to a level of hybrid warfare which we need to look at, not just because we need to be there and to be of assistance to those countries because we are all in it together, but also because it is a portent of what could happen to us. So it is right to describe Moldova, and we heard yesterday from the committee from Anna Ravenko about the ongoing hybrid warfare that Moldova is subjected to. It is at the forefront of hybrid warfare. It has cyber attacks, illicit financing schemes, prolific information manipulation campaigns, political rhetoric espoused by Kremlin-linked actors. Now, there may be some of us sitting here thinking, well, we already have some of that. In fact, we probably have all of that. But we only have that at a low level. But we're heading for elections, and elections are always a time when a democracy is at its most vulnerable. We must not be complacent. I fear that sometimes we are. We are a great democracy. We've been going for a long time. We think, I'll be fine. Because, of course, we're an island. If we were Finland and had Russia right on our border, we'd have a very different attitude. But in modern times, it doesn't matter whether you have a land border or not. They can still try and influence your democracy by undermining you particularly. And I think it is clear, if we open our eyes, we can see there is ongoing disinformation that is trying to undermine our democracy right now. And the problem is the public are not alive to it. And the last thing anybody ever wants to admit is that they have been lied to and they've fallen for it, and trying to explain to them afterwards that they've done that is just impossible. But we need to make sure that we are countering it right now. Because I'm telling you, as far as the Russians are concerned, we are, as Europe is, when it comes to Europe, we are a number one enemy. We are absolutely, when you look at their rhetoric and the sort of things that they say about us, it is absolutely Britain who they loathe more than practically any other country. I'm proud of that. But I think that we need to be mindful of what it means for our country. They believe that we are responsible for triggering the Second World War, that we are responsible for triggering many subsequent conflicts. In today's context, this is projected onto the war in Ukraine, where Britain is portrayed not merely as a supporter of Kyiv, but as the architect and the main driver of the conflict. You listen to some of the things which their Secret Service have been saying about us openly. It's as if everything that's happening in Ukraine is down to us. I wish it was. But I fear that the rhetoric is definitely against us. They advance this kind of conspiracy vision in which Britain is not just acting as Ukraine's ally, but rather as the mastermind behind a proxy war, persuading Europe to fight to the last Ukrainian. The chairman of the State Duma even alleged recently that we were orchestrating specific incidents, such as the shelling of Belgorod, close to the Ukrainian border. And so it goes on. Their propaganda routinely accuses the UK of being involved in terrorist attacks and acts of sabotage targeting Russian nationals. They include the poisoning of Litvinenko, the blowing up of the Nord Stream pipelines in the Baltic Sea. It seems all of this is down to us. And the terrorist attack committed by Islamists at the Crocus City Hall. If you read the propaganda, they continue to point the finger at Britain. It used to be America, but for some reason America's not in their sights so much anymore, but we are. And in a way we should be proud of it. But we need to be mindful of this, and we need to stick together, and we need to stand with Ukraine. We stand with Ukraine, they fight the war for us, and we continue to give them every support, and we should be proud of it. And I am proud of the fact that in this chamber and in this country, we are united behind them, with the exception of those who are not here this afternoon. But we remain united, and we must remain united until the end, until victory. Slava Ukraine.
I call the Liberal Democrat spokesperson, James MacCleary.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the time for this debate on Ukraine today, as we meet at a key moment. American peace proposals welcomed by the Kremlin suggested demilitarised zones and buffer areas, phrases that sound technical, but whose consequences could be catastrophic. Ukrainian people see such proposals for what they are: a ruse to circumvent Ukraine's defences and continue the invasion later. Russia's relentless assault in the east has intensified despite them reaching and passing the grim milestone of 1 million Russian troops killed or injured on the front line. Zaporizhia, a city of 670,000 people, is now under serious threat. Russian drones are striking the city itself. Emergency services have prepared a plan to evacuate a third of the population if fighting damages the nearby nuclear power station. This is the reality of Putin's war. Madam Deputy Speaker, President Trump is unreliable, unpredictable and disdainful of the rule of law. Just look at his actions in Venezuela. Britain must take an active role in ensuring Ukraine's interests remain at the heart of all future negotiations, reinforcing collective deterrence and signalling that European security and Ukraine's sovereignty remain non-negotiable. That also requires honesty about the United States. What concrete security guarantees have actually been secured? And can the government seriously assure this House that they would endure beyond the next conversation between President Trump and Vladimir Putin? The United Kingdom and France have committed to the potential deployment of troops in Ukraine should a peace deal be agreed. Any discussion of UK or French troops on the ground must be about deterrence, not escalation, limited in scope, tied to a political settlement, and never an open-ended deployment. It is right that the Prime Minister has committed to putting any deployment of British forces to Ukraine to a vote in this place. Any commitment of this kind, though, must be credible. That means having the personnel, the equipment, the logistics and the funding in place, not just to deploy, but to sustain a force over time. Serious questions remain about our current ability to do that. So can the Minister set out in clear terms how the government intends to ensure any future deployment to Ukraine will be fully resourced, properly equipped and sustainably funded, and not announced before the means to deliver it actually exist? The government must increase the size of our armed forces, plug gaps in military capability and fix the broken procurement processes. Without a clear defence investment plan for our military, it undermines the credibility of announcements of overseas deployments. Alongside military deterrence, we must also apply maximum economic pressure. Yesterday morning, Madam Deputy Speaker, residents in my constituency were surprised to wake up to find various fruit and vegetables and cans of milk distributed across our beaches in Seaford and Newhaven. A container ship passing through the channel had shed some containers in the last few weeks and they'd washed up. Another day, they could find their beaches covered in oil, leaked from a sanctioned Russian tanker, part of the Russian shadow fleet, also passing through the channel. That is why we must take every action possible, not just to restrict the shadow fleet to prevent the flow of money into Russia, but also because it presents an active threat to this country's security, both its economic security, military security, but also our environmental security. We welcome, therefore, the government's announcement to ban UK companies from providing services such as insurance or maintenance to ships carrying Russian liquefied natural gas. It is a big step in the right direction and we genuinely welcome it. UK-owned or insured carriers have transported £45 billion worth of Russian products since 2022. But we must do more. The government's recent oil price cap reduction is insufficient. Liberal Democrats believe the cap should be lowered to at least $30 a barrel, with stricter enforcement to ensure no UK money supports Russia's war effort. The government should also be giving serious consideration to a total ban on Russian oil and gas exports. I think many people would also share my astonishment at the news that the UK still imports £1.7 billion worth of goods and services from Russia, and that this figure actually increased in 2025. The most impactful contribution this government could make, though, is pushing for allied action to unlock frozen Russian assets. My honourable friend, the member for Bicester and Woodstock, has introduced a bill to seize billions in frozen Russian assets and direct proceeds to Ukraine's defence and reconstruction. It is also welcome that the government is threatening legal action to secure £2.5 billion from Roman Abramovich's Chelsea sale. Liberal Democrats have called for this for over a year. It should never have taken this long, but we very much welcome forward movement in this area. Putin must be punished, not rewarded. So it was deeply disappointing to see the European Union fail to agree on a reparations loan using Russian assets. Britain must show great resolve and make Putin pay literally for his invasion. Madam Deputy Speaker, we are all appalled by the abduction of tens of thousands of Ukrainian children. This is a war crime. We support the Bring Kids Back initiative and the Yale Humanitarian Research Lab. However, these initiatives are in danger due to President Trump cutting their funding. Again, frozen Russian assets could be used to fund this shortfall. Support for Ukraine also means doing right by Ukrainians here in the UK. Ministers must provide certainty on length of leave to remain and urgently resolve the status of young Ukrainians studying at our universities and colleges who cannot be left in prolonged legal limbo. Russia continues to pose a profound strategic threat through its invasion, cyber attacks and energy coercion. That threat extends far beyond Ukraine, particularly to the Baltic states, and deterrent there must therefore be pan-European if it is to be credible. It would be wholly inappropriate to contemplate restoring Russia's G7 membership. The UK must oppose Russia's readmission. The United Kingdom must step up its contribution to European defence through NATO, the Joint Expeditionary Force and deeper cooperation with our European allies, and be unequivocal in defending the sovereignty of all NATO partners, including in the High North and in Greenland. Aggression and violations of sovereignty will not be rewarded. Madam Deputy Speaker, as we debate in comfort, Ukrainian soldiers man defensive positions in freezing conditions. Ukrainian civilians flee their homes. Ukrainian families live with the daily terror of drone and missile strikes. They are fighting for freedom, sovereignty, and their very existence. They are fighting for principles we claim to hold dear: democracy, the rule of law, self-determination. Will we stand for them for as long as it takes, or will we allow fatigue and the bullying of autocrats to erode our resolve? The Liberal Democrats are clear. We will not look away. We will not accept an unjust peace. We will push for maximum economic pressure, for seizing frozen Russian assets, for proper support for Ukraine's defence, and for democratic oversight of any British military involvement. The unity of this House, with one party a small but notable exception, reflects the strength of the British people's commitment to our Ukrainian friends. They must be tired, but we must never tire of talking about them in this place. They are fighting for all our futures, and we must continue to stand by their side for as long as it takes.
We have 16 speakers, and I don't want to put a speaking limit on, but if everybody speaks for around 8 minutes and monitors themselves, and everybody will then get an equal 8 minutes. So let's try and be mindful. David Taylor.
I shall try and take your advice, but I want to start by paying tribute to what others have said already, and also to the fact that there are a number of MPs in this House of all parties that are contributing in lots of different ways in trying to stand up for the Ukrainian people, not only in speeches in this House, but actual initiatives that they're doing. And I just want to very briefly talk about my own motivation, which actually does start in Syria. I refer to my register of interests, of which I have a role regarding Syria. Members of the House will know that I have a deep-seated passion for seeing that the Syrian people have a proper, free and inclusive future after years of brutal dictatorship from Assad. And of course, Putin was central to that. 500,000 people died in Syria because of the actions of Assad and Putin. And I do believe that if our country and the US had taken a stronger role back in 2013 when that red line was set, I do question whether or not Putin would have felt emboldened to invade Ukraine, Crimea in 2014. And I do also just want to take a moment to reflect on something that the Minister said about parties not being absent here, because there's another party that's not absent here, which is your party. And there is a number of members of that party and a number of members of the hard left that look to this conflict in Ukraine and blame the West. And members might remember a ridiculous statement that blamed NATO expansion on the reasons why Putin invaded Ukraine. Let's be absolutely clear. There was no excuse, and there never will be, for Putin's actions in Ukraine.
Will you give in that point?
I will.
Does he agree that if anybody has any doubt about Putin's motives or morality, they should look to who his partners are in this war? Iran, a country who's killing its own people on its streets and is now executing them. Is he not an absolute disgrace? And anybody that shows any sympathy for Putin really should look at who his friends are.
Well, I think we know who their friends are. That's a matter of public record. And I completely agree. And if I'd had time to say this yesterday, I would have spoken in the Iran statement about the role that Iran is playing in Ukraine. Shahed drones that we've all, if we've been to Ukraine, have had to cower from, are being provided by the Iranian regime. So the sooner they fall, the better. I do want to praise the party opposite for the role that they played in the lead up to the conflict, as well as my own. In particular, Ben Wallace for the role that he played, and in particular getting those N-laws in place, because it was so crucial at the start of the conflict that Kyiv did not fall. And of course, much as we might praise the actions of our government or any other government, we also have to, of course, praise the bravery of the Ukrainian people at the start of that conflict in stopping those tanks rolling into Kyiv. I'm very grateful to the work that ministers are doing and the Prime Minister is doing to try and support the Ukrainian people, the billions that are going in defence spending. We've heard some of those figures already. I'm particularly grateful to see the £3.5 billion industrial treaty that's going to be spent on hardware, the continued support for Interflex training, the Ukraine Defence Contact Group with over 50 partners, and also the British-built Octopus drones that are going to be so crucial as well. I just very briefly want to say that I absolutely welcome the talks towards ceasefire. Who wouldn't want a ceasefire? And I also welcome the commitment with France to deploying peacekeepers at a future point. But I do want to share my own concern that we, of course, need to keep continuing support to the Ukrainian people, because my personal fear about any pause in fighting is that the Russians will just use it as an opportunity to regroup and go again. And we cannot be under any illusion as to the threat of Russia. Many of us have also been part of the Armed Forces Parliamentary Scheme. I had an opportunity to go and visit our fantastic troops in the NATO base in Estonia just before Christmas. And it really does bring home just how real the threat from Russia continues to be. And I'd also like to refer to a couple of trips that I've also made myself to Ukraine since the conflict has started. The most recent one, almost a year ago, actually, which was focused on drone technology and the absolute imperative of supporting the Ukrainians to defend themselves. And we had some absolutely amazing meetings whilst we were over there with the Deputy Defence Minister, Sergei Boyev, but also with MPs, Ukrainian MPs that many of you will know, Dmytro Nataluka and Alexander Marazkovsky, who are members of the Economics Affairs Committee. And I think it was Dmytro who actually referred to the vital importance of drones and the need for what he called a Kalashnikovs in the sky. And what he meant by that was that a Kalashnikov, of course, is a very durable weapon where if it does break in any way, it's very easy to repair. What the Ukrainians continue to need, as well as the sort of most important high technology that we see, is they need these everyday drones that can really help on the front line to do reconnaissance so that they know where the Russian positions are, but also to help them as they try and make advances. So yes, we need investments in advanced technology, but we also need the sort of Kalashnikovs of the sky, weapons that are where the parts are easy to come by, where it's easy for them to repair as well. And at this point, on the subject of drones, I also want to echo a point that the Honourable Member for Romford made, which is that I agree that we need to look at how we can get more UK finance into Ukraine through joint ventures that can help with the production of drones as well. And if we can work with the City of London to look at ways in which we can unlock any barriers that might exist, I think that's absolutely a worthwhile venture, because we do need to get more capital into the country to help Ukrainian companies, as well as our own, to build drones. I mean, the Octopus drone scheme is a brilliant example of trying to work with the Ukrainians. I think there is a real opportunity here. The Ukrainians have got the data, they've got the real lived experience that can help us build drones together that will help us in turn, as well as them, in this war. So, yes, I hope in the wind-ups the Minister might talk about the ways in which we can work with the City of London to unlock more capital into the country. I also briefly want to talk about a second trip that I did way back in 2024 when I was a humble candidate, because there are a number of organisations around the country of ordinary people up and down the UK who are trying to help in a really grassroots way, in any way they can. And in this moment when there is lots of talk of people talking about charity begins at home and sort of thinking about problems just here alone, I think it's remarkable there have been so many ordinary people around the country who have stepped up and helped people that they will probably never meet. But some people have gone out to Ukraine, and I want to pay tribute to them. I myself went out with an organisation called Help 99, who deliver pickup trucks that maybe a farmer doesn't need anymore, that soldiers are using on the front line to get from A to B. Again, to that earlier point, the long-range missiles and all the sort of expensive technology is really important. But we do also need the things that are going to get into the ground that are going to help the soldiers on a more general level. And on that note, I want to just pay tribute to those organisations. I had the privilege of hosting an event here in Parliament last year where over 60 individuals and over 30 organisations from around the country came together. I'd really like to encourage the government to look at ways, and it's my final point, Madam Deputy Speaker, where we can ensure that any excess vehicles on the government estate, be it the Home Office or Network Rail or so on, can be donated cheaply. Let's get the Treasury to write off these vehicles. It wouldn't cost that much money, but it would make a difference to ordinary soldiers on the front line. Thank you very much.
Father of the House.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I know you want us to keep our comments fairly brief, so to save time, I want to associate myself completely with what the Minister said in his support for Ukraine and the opposition spokespeople and the chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee. So Ukraine's fight is our fight. They are brave and noble people showing enormous courage. None of us here have any sympathy whatsoever for Putin and what he has done. And I think we should be reasonably confident, not downhearted. We should be proud of what we've done as a nation from the very start, and I don't think we should assume that Putin is necessarily going to win. He's got an economy the size of Spain or perhaps of Italy. We have vastly more resources. These regimes can seem very strong, where they can collapse very quickly. Who knows what's going to happen? He's only a prototype dictator. In the 4 years, he's only marched 30 miles, where Stalin marched all the way from the Volga to Berlin. So, yes, all right, he's refusing all these peace offers. He's determined to get the rest of the Donbass. I agree that over 4 years, thousands more dying, his economy destroyed, he might get another 30 miles and get the rest of the Donbass. But so what? What's he going to achieve for his country? It's so cruel, unnecessary, pointless. There is criticism of Mr. Trump, but at least he's trying to get some sort of peace deal. And I think our influence is limited, but we should support his efforts. But one thing we can't support is cravenly getting a peace deal which allows Russia to grab even more territory that it has failed to get over the last 4 years and get the fortresses that Ukraine needs for its survival. So there is hope. Now, I know that some people think that it's almost as bad as Germany invading Poland in 1939. It's almost worse, because I've made it my job, really, to, over the last 40 years, partly because my wife is half Russian, to try and understand the Russian psyche. I think it's worse in a sense, because so many Russians, not the Russians I know, of course, or I associate with, but so many nationalist Russians view Ukraine means border country, as part of Russia. They view Kiev like we view Canterbury, as the source of the Russian Rus. So I'm afraid these Russian nationalists will not give up. They want to grab the whole country. So we must remain firm. I would go along with anything the government wants to do in support of Ukraine in terms of sanctions, upping sanctions, stopping tankers, doing anything they like. But in the few moments that I have, I do want to question the government on this idea of sending a small force of British troops, the coalition of the willing. I don't want to be the coalition of the naive willing. I mean, I've sat through so many of these debates. The debate on Iraq, where I was one of only 15 Tory MPs to oppose Blair's invasion, the Afghanistan debates, the Syria debate, where I refused to support Mr. Cameron. There is so much danger here in deploying perhaps just 7,000 British under-resourced troops in a country the size of France, with a population of the size of France, with an 800-mile front, where thousands of people have been dying every month. 7,000 people. Now, if America was prepared to come in, if it was a NATO operation, then I think the House would be very willing to accept our involvement. But compare this with what was happening in West Germany. Compare the size of our army now to our size of the army then. Do you know that we had, Madam Deputy Speaker, 120,000 service personnel in Germany? We had 55,000 British troops, excluding the RAF, in West Germany. We had 900,000 NATO troops in West Germany, including the Bundeswehr. America was totally committed. Now, my honourable friend, I noticed what the Liberal Democrat spokesman said. They didn't immediately say, oh, I'm going to support the government, did they? They asked some quite serious questions. And we, if we have this debate, have got to go on asking these questions. What are the rules of engagement? What happens if I'm right and Putin will accept some temporary ceasefire and then we'll march in again? What's going to happen to our 7,000 troops?
Listening very carefully to what the Right Honourable Gentleman is saying, and I do take on board his points, but I think one of the things that we have yet to perhaps give sufficient emphasis to is whether or not Putin actually wants peace. Because I fully understand that plans need to be made in case there is a peace, but it is rather based on the idea that he actually wants to stop. And I, for one, am not really sure that he does.
No, I agree with that entirely. I'm not sure this is ever going to happen. I'm not sure there's ever going to be a ceasefire. I think he's just determined to carry on and for another 4 years and again another 30 miles. So I agree with the Honourable Lady. But I do think as the National Parliament here, given the size of our army, given the resources that we have, I think we have a right to question the Prime Minister. Now, I quite understand if you're Prime Minister, it's hell. You know, you've got to deal with the NHS, with the farmers, with the Conservative Party. Much better to be grandstanding. The Liberal Democrat, much better to be grandstanding on the world stage and say, yes, we're prepared to put our troops in. But it is grandstanding, and it is extremely dangerous. And I'll end on this point. Just imagine, I know it's probably not going to happen, but there is a ceasefire, we put it in, Putin marches again. Does anybody here, really, in their heart of hearts, want to be involved in a shooting war with Russia? Does anybody here, I've got grown-up children, does anybody want to hear their son to be called out there and be killed by a Russian drone, as thousands of brave Ukrainians are? This is serious stuff. So I'm so pleased that the two opposition parties are asking the questions, and that's what we all need to do.
Follow that, Johanna Baxter.
Yeah. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And it will come as no surprise to colleagues across the House the issue that I want to focus on in my contribution, which is the treatment of the Ukrainian children. Because when I first visited Ukraine, that was the issue that struck me to my core. The fact that Russia have stolen 20,000 Ukrainian children from their homes, and Russian authorities themselves report that over 700 Ukrainian children have now been officially registered in Russia. A heinous war crime that continues today unabated. And 1.6 million children in the occupied territories are being subject to militarisation and indoctrination. And in recent months, we have seen clear and deeply disturbing evidence, alongside harrowing testimony from Ukrainian children who have been abducted by Russia and from those trapped in the occupied territories, that the militarisation of Ukrainian children is accelerating at pace. It is no longer about propaganda quietly slipped into classrooms. What we are now seeing is the deliberate transformation of schools into instruments of war. An $8 billion down payment on Russia's future military. Ukrainian children being placed on so-called specialised tracks, funnelled into paramilitary movements, now firmly embedded within the education system. Children are prescribed mandatory hours of military training and forced to attend military camps. And if they refuse, they risk failing their secondary education, leaving conscription into the Russian military as the only future left to them. One child told Save Ukraine, "They showed us different types of grenades and mines, how much pressure a mine can withstand when it explodes, how to lay mines, clear areas, set tripwires and dig trenches. Whilst I was digging a trench, they deliberately threw a grenade in to make it feel like the real battlefield." And another child, recently rescued by Save Ukraine, reported that Russian soldiers conduct psychological testing, asking questions of them like, "How do you feel about killing? Do you enjoy hurting people? And do you want to be a tank operator or a pilot?" That fear of violence and punishment of forced conscription is not isolated. It has become a daily reality for those living in the occupied territories. It's not education, it's coercion, it's cold, it's calculated, and chillingly familiar from the darkest chapters of occupation in history. For those children not trained to fight, they're trained to police. They're being shaped as the next generation of law enforcement officials. And whose laws are they being taught to enforce? Putin's. Laws that silence dissent through violence. Laws that tear children from families. Laws that now allow children as young as 14 to be prosecuted for terrorism with penalties reaching life imprisonment simply for opposing Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine. Children in the occupied territories live under constant surveillance. Their phones are checked, their social media is monitored, and any sign of Ukrainian consciousness is routinely treated as suspicious, disloyal, and extremism. And Russia's treatment of the children reveals their long-term strategy, with deep security implications for Europe and NATO. I am proud of the leadership the United Kingdom has shown in standing with Ukraine, from the arms we've supplied to the sanctuary we've provided. But I'm deeply concerned that whilst reports suggest we're 90% of the way towards a peace agreement, the language on the abducted Ukrainian children remains disturbingly vague. There is no clarity on how the stolen children will be traced. There's no clarity on how they will be returned, bearing in mind that many have now been trafficked to Belarus or North Korea. What happens to the youngest children who were ripped from their homes and may not now be able to remember a time before they were placed with Russian families? And who will adjudicate if there are disputes on the documentation of children, bearing in mind that many mothers in the occupied territories were forced to register their children as Russian simply to secure maternity care? And there remain disparities between the individuals that we in this country have sanctioned for the forced deportation of Ukrainian children and those sanctioned by the EU and US. I've flagged those disparities to the Minister, and I completely understand he cannot comment on further designations, but I urge him to look again at that list. And I do thank the Minister very sincerely for his efforts, because I know he takes this issue incredibly seriously. And to that end, can I urge him to ensure that the same determination and resolve that is shown to the international coalition of the willing is now, at this pivotal time in peace negotiations, shown to the international coalition for the return of Ukrainian children? And will he push for a meeting of that coalition again at the earliest opportunity so that they can establish a clear post-war plan to secure international consensus on the fate of the abducted children and make absolutely clear that their return must be a non-negotiable next step in any peace deal between Russia and Ukraine? There can be no lasting peace without the return of the stolen children. Slava Ukraine.
Sir Bernard Jenkin.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I shall be as brief as I possibly can. I very much welcome this debate. though it did come as a bit of a surprise, and I think one of the reasons that not very many people are here is they weren't really prepared for this debate, and there is no Prime Minister and no motion, and out of 400 Labour MPs, there's fewer than 20 in the House, which I think projects an unfortunate message for a government debate on Ukraine, but nevertheless I still welcome it. But I do look forward to a proper debate on a proper motion where there may even be whipping, and everyone will have to turn up and hear what the Prime Minister's got to say, particularly about this deployment, which I'll come to in a minute. I'm not going to repeat the speech I had the privilege of delivering in the debate granted to me by the Backbench Business Committee on the 4th of December, except just to reiterate that Russia cannot win this war militarily. They will only win because of Western weakness, because of our weakness, our lack of resolve. If we support Ukraine, Russia cannot win, which is why his diplomatic efforts are so vigorous. And there's far more that we could do than we are doing. And in particular, we could rearm our own armed forces much more quickly than we are. And I know I get smiles from the government front bench when I say this, because they agree with me, but this government is not delivering the scale of the defence spending increases that we need. Very briefly, I'm going to be as swift as I possibly can.
Just today it was reported 18 tankers from the Russian Shadow Fleet have passed through the Channel since the Defence Secretary's statement in this House on the 7th of January on curtailing Russian oil exports. So does he agree with me that we must show the Russians we mean what we say?
I completely agree. And there should be a NATO operation to intercept every ship that comes into the operational area of NATO in the North Atlantic and the North Sea, around the north of Scotland. We could choke off a significant amount of this, and we're not doing it. We're letting it carry on. Now, getting all the NATO Europe powers in line with that, that's a problem, but let's do it. The NATO nations in Europe together could show Trump we are prepared to deliver for European security, but we're not doing that at the moment. But I think it is essential for us to discuss this so-called coalition of the willing. Now, we all know that there are some armed forces personnel in Ukraine already, and they're providing advice and logistics and training and intelligence and supporting planning in HQs and that sort of thing. Actually, we've probably got more to learn about fighting the Russians from the Ukrainians than we can teach them. But 7,500 troops, informed units, a brigade, supporting a combat battalion or two. Is this what we're talking about? I've got very, very grave doubts about this. What would be the rules of engagement? How would we provide for core security? Would we be just presenting a lovely target for Russians to attack, which they might not attack directly, they might be accidental, but that sort of, they would blur the areas and create all sorts of problems if we were so overt, unless we've got a force in there that can actually fight and defend itself against the Russians. I have my doubts about this. And how we would respond if Russia escalated in that situation is a very open question. But I have no desire to be an armchair critic of the government's policy. And this brings me to the main point I want to make. It's become fashionable to believe that Parliament has a right to tell the government when or when not to deploy troops. There is no constitutional basis for this whatsoever. In fact, that the Prime Minister assumes his office, he takes the seals of office, and takes the responsibility upon himself about when to direct the armed forces into harm's way. And there is no constitutional impediment for him doing that. What we saw in the Syria debate, and I commend the Honourable Member for Hemel Hempstead for his most excellent speech, what we saw in the Syria debate was a humiliating abdication of the government's responsibility when it knew it was right to deploy an armed force in Syria, and then it volunteered not to do so because of a very finely balanced debate and vote in the House of Commons. And the Prime Minister stood there and said, OK, I get it. I mean, this is really O-level politics, O-level statesmancraft. It was ridiculous, and he's completely right. It projected weakness when we knew that the Russians were supporting the Syrian government in murdering and deploying chemical weapons on their own people. And it was weak of Obama to say this was a red line and then failed to do anything about it. We projected weakness. We invited Putin to try again, and I totally agree with him about the consequences of that. Now, the point is, the government has the responsibility to make this judgment. It cannot pass this judgment to 650 armchair generals jaw-jawing in the House of Commons when we don't have the intelligence, we don't have the assessments. We can express our views, and we can hold the government to account for the outcome of what they decide, but I put it to him that put it to the Minister that in that debate on Syria, we learned something, that the Prime Minister doesn't resign when he loses a crucial vote. Now, part of that was the Fixed Term Parliaments Act. I mean, if he'd made it a vote of confidence, would he have won it? Would there have been a general election? No, there wouldn't have been. He might have had to resign, but there wouldn't have been a general election. And we were in a very artificial point. But I put it to the Minister this time. If the Prime Minister brings a vote to the House of Commons and he loses it, he would have to resign and hand over to somebody else, or he would have to call a general election, because we no longer have a fixed-term parliament. We're back to real accountability, because the accountability counts at the ballot box and the final analysis. The one power the Prime Minister has is to call a general election and ask the King to dissolve Parliament, and if he'd lost such a vote, that would be the only honourable thing for him to do. But he cannot come here and engage in the kind of abject, humiliating abdication of responsibility we've seen before. And just ask about the other experience. The government of the day won the Iraq vote. I happen to think it was still right. We got a democracy in Iraq of sorts. Iraq is no longer a Soviet puppet, a Russian puppet. But who in this House still believes that was the right decision? The polls went in favour of the Iraq war at the last minute. Maybe that helped Tony Blair get the vote over the line. Was that a good basis for making a decision? No, it wasn't. Either the government makes this decision for itself and holds itself accountable to this House, or don't accept the seals of office, don't become Prime Minister, because that's the job.
Alex Sobel.
Speaker. I'd like to start by thanking the Leader of the House for giving us this debate. He could have chosen any topic to fill the space this afternoon, but he chose for us to have this debate on Ukraine. And I'd like to say it's a privilege to serve as chair of the Ukraine APPG. I can see many members of the APPG here. It isn't full. Other members can still join. We would like to have every backbench member of the House as a member of the APPG. But I think I want to start with first-person narrative about what is happening in Ukraine now. As we approach the midway point through the Ukrainian winter, in the middle of January, the realities, lived experience of what midwinter Kyiv really means and feels like. Russia continues to have the ability to strike on a daily basis and take out Ukraine's energy infrastructure. Their energy security is constantly under fire. I spoke with Lesia Vasilenko. I know many people here know Lesia, the chair of the British group in the Rada, who's in Kyiv. She said to me, I've had no heating in my flat for 4 days. And this was yesterday. It's -10. It's now -13. This is the situation in half of Kyiv. No electricity, apart from a couple of hours in the night. Some buildings have no water. I'm writing this to you in total darkness and wearing 4 layers. The schools are not working. The sound of generators is less and less heard as they're breaking down en masse, given they're not designed to work non-stop and in such low temperatures. Hospitals are working at limited capacity, and every night Russia is deliberately hitting more and more power generator facilities and gas infrastructure. Their task is to freeze Kyiv out. At one point, Mayor Klitschko even appealed to the people of Kyiv to leave the city. Putin's invasion nearly 4 years ago resulted in millions fleeing their homes, hundreds of thousands of casualties and relentless attacks on hospitals, homes and schools. She continues. This includes Russian state-sponsored abductions of Ukrainian children, which my honourable friend so brilliantly spoke about, and the arrest of my colleagues at the OSCE, Dmitry Shabanov, Maxim Petrov and Vadim Golda, who I know that my honourable friend, the member for Washington, is raising as an OSCE rep on Ukraine. Leslie is the OSCE PA chair, the parliamentary support team for Ukraine. So I'm really happy that we can support her and continue to support the work that's going on now in terms of our support for their energy infrastructure. Octopus signed a significant deal with DTEC, a large private energy company in Ukraine, for £100 million. We need to see much more like that. I was really pleased my honourable friend, the Minister, spoke about that bunker under the school on the south bank of Kiev that we both went to together when we were in opposition. And we just need to think about those children now, not in that school which has got a generator, but in their homes, freezing, and all of those other people, millions of people in Kiev now being frozen out, and what more we need to do, not just provide emergency energy generation, but also that long-term, renewable, secure energy. Because for us, renewable energy is a matter of energy transition and all those things. We just had the statement right before this. But for them, it's national security. It means the difference between being able to heat their homes, be able to keep the lights on, be able to use their mobile phones, and not. Because it's much easier to take out a gas-fired power station or a nuclear power station by the Russians than it is to take out a wind farm or a solar farm. And we need to ensure that we do everything we can in terms of Ukraine's energy infrastructure. I just want to move on quickly just to talk about, because one of the things that I do as the chair is I write many letters every week for Ukrainian members of the RADA to be able to come and visit us here. And I know that is not just members of RADA, that is right across the piece, because so many Ukrainians have family members here, have other ties to the UK, but it is still so difficult for Ukrainians to get visas. I just want to ask the Minister about how can we further reduce bureaucracy for Ukrainians to come here and liberalise those short-term travel visas, which are, I'm afraid to say, still difficult to get. I just want to briefly talk about sanctions. Sanctions are one of the few non-military tools capable of influencing Russian policy. They act as leverage that should not be given away without meaningful concessions. Without conditions, such as withdrawal to 1991 borders and binding agreements on reparations, ceasefire could freeze the conflict in a way that perpetuates instability. Europe and the UK cannot repeat the mistake of 2014 when sanctions over Crimea and the Donbass were limited and political will dissipated. That leniency enabled Moscow to believe that further escalation would be tolerated and led to the full-scale invasion of 2022. So my view is that whatever happens, whatever negotiation, whatever agreement, we need to keep Russian sanctions in place. We need to continue to restrict their ability to operate, because we are... my concern is that we will allow future conflicts to happen because Russia's territorial ambitions are not constrained just to Ukraine or to any agreement to freeze the conflict.
On the topic of sanctions, will my honourable friend give way?
I will give way.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way, and he is a tireless champion for the UK-Ukraine relationship, including through the 100-year partnership. Yeah. Does he agree with me that it is worth commending the government on the action that has been taken in the past month in issuing a licence through OFSI to try and move forward the £2.5 billion proceeds of Chelsea Football Club money that remains frozen and has done for almost 4 years now, that could be used to support the victims of conflict, including in Ukraine? And will he also join me in calling on the government to try and move faster in unlocking the more than £700,000 worth of assets that belong to Peter Arvin, one of Putin's closest oligarch friends, that was been frozen for quite some time now by the National Crime Agency, that could also be used to support the Ukrainian people?
Thank you. My honourable friend is absolutely right. It's taken too long to see that Chelsea money. My honourable friend from Hemel, Hempstead, talked about the aid convoys. Can you imagine what they could do with that money from the Chelsea sale in terms of supporting Ukraine? What we could do in terms of buying generators, in terms of what we could do in terms of energy infrastructure with those billions, actually, from the Chelsea sale.
Member briefly give way.
All right.
I just want to say very briefly that I hope that if that money is unlocked, we do also look in which ways we can compensate the money that is then going into Ukraine to free up money that might be able to go to other conflicts around the world where we've had to sadly make some reductions due to the cut in the aid budget.
My friend is inviting me to comment on our ODA cuts, which I think we probably share the same opinion about. And I think actually that absolutely that there's a principle here about reparations, whether that is from the Russian state or from individuals that have benefited from this war or from the gangster kleptocracy that runs Russia. So we need to do both those things, and I think that there is there probably a wider discussion to be had about how we can support Ukraine and actually retrench some of those money to some of the other areas, particularly areas like Syria and hopefully actually Iran, that will need ODA money from the UK now and in the near future. I know my time is nearly up, so I'm just going to make a couple of questions which the Minister can answer at the end. So in terms of this much vexed question about our deployment of troops to Ukraine, it is very early, and I just want to maybe counsel some members when they're talking about this, that when you're talking about in terms of the language and the approach, we need to be very reminiscent of the run-up to the Second World War and how Lord Halifax approached this, and that there was an agreement in Munich, and Chamberlain said that it would be peace in our time, and then the war started, and the war came to us. Russia's territorial ambitions are not limited; they are unlimited. Yep. And we need to be very cognizant of that. And we need to be on the front foot and not on the back foot. And I understand all of the concerns about our ability to deploy troops. So my question really is, what planning are we doing at this stage? What's the process? What can we do to reassure MPs and the public that we are making the right planning steps towards that? And thinking what we can do now, we have very welcomely, and I'm sure my honourable friend, the Defence Minister, will be able to answer this, we have very welcomely announced plans to develop new tactical ballistic missiles with Ukraine, strengthen Ukraine's ability to defend itself against Russia. Could the government talk more about how we're going to do this and when we're going to do this and what the timelines are? Because our own air defences are insufficient, and we need to think in the future that if this war is protracted, if Putin doesn't settle, if we don't get to a ceasefire, then we ourselves could be threatened by drones, by missiles, by all those things that we hear about every day in Ukraine. And we need to be ready for our own defence as well as the defence of Ukraine. Thank you.
There are still 12 members wishing to speak. I wasn't going to propose to put a formal time limit on, so please could members perhaps restrict themselves to about 5 minutes. And should we learn from example before I put a formal limit on? Stephen Gethins.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Minister for his comments and associate myself with his comments as well? I've got some significant and substantive questions to ask, but I want to reflect for a moment on the human side of this conflict, and that's important. And the member for Paisley and Renfrewshire South did that, as she always did, very, very well. I've travelled a lot to Ukraine over the past 20 years for work and for other purposes. One of the most significant was on Friday night when I drove into Kyiv during the bombardment. And I was reminded that that bombardment on actually the early hours of Friday morning was not aimed at any military target. It was aimed at the energy infrastructure as temperatures in Kyiv reached -15 and subsequently -20. Madam Deputy Speaker, it was nippy. I had somewhere warm to go to, unlike so many people. And what was perhaps told us a little bit more about the Russian administration and the way it conducts its war were the double-tap strikes. They hit apartment blocks, and then shortly thereafter, they hit again, killing ambulance workers reacting. Ambulance workers reacting. I then travelled to Sumy, I believe. I was one of the first British members of Parliament to travel to Sumy since the start of the full-scale invasion, where we have a partnership agreement between Angus Council and my constituency and the people of Sumy, because that sense of solidarity must
go beyond Kiev, and I'm sure our friends in Kiev won't mind that. And I want to give a shout out to the people of Sumy who welcomed me. But as we lay flowers to the 37 people killed in an artillery attack who were out shopping, we were moved on very, very quickly. We couldn't even mourn, we couldn't even mark our respects for too much longer. And as the Governor of Sumy said to me, that human element is so important. And can I give a shout out to Timmergreens Primary School in my constituency? Miss Baird's class, led by Mrs Bezick, wrote letters to children in Sumy as well. And although I took other gifts, I took a tartan scarf, and colleagues from Scotland will understand that, and I mentioned other areas of connection. It was those simple letters from primary school children in my constituency that meant so much to everybody else in Ukraine. They were beautifully written and they were exceptional. And I want to pay tribute to them because it talks to us about some of the more significant issues that we're dealing with. That human element tells us why Ukraine is fighting. That human element tells us why we have a responsibility across Europe to help Ukraine at its time of need. And therefore, and I won't, okay, very briefly, but I'm mindful of time.
Very briefly, and say this. Does the Honourable Gentleman agree when it comes to accountability for those who carried out massacres, who have raped, who have killed, who have violently have tortured people, that there must be accountability, and those Russians who did it must be brought to court and then put in prison afterwards?
I thank the member, and I was going to touch upon, let me touch upon these issues so I try and keep to time. One is exactly that, one of accountability and how important that is. I know that's something that the members agree with, and the member for Strangford quite rightly sets that out. On that local element, could the Minister please speak to us about the 100-year agreement? I get the role that this place has, a really important role that this place has in response to the war in Ukraine, but the message that I had in my travels at the weekend was how important that local-to-local impact is and that solidarity is. And maybe you can talk to us about the conversations he's had with devolved and local administrations in terms of the 100-year agreement, because when it comes to issues like education and other such issues, these are matters for those administrations rather than this one, and I do think it's important to involve others in that going forward. Finally is this, and it's the more substantive issue. We face a significant challenge in terms of European security and have done for some years. The transatlantic relationship is not quite what it was. In terms of the transatlantic relationship, we must look to Canada in many ways. But that common European approach to how we defend Ukraine, who are defending us, after all, is going to be incredibly important, and it would be good to hear, I know the Minister, the Defence Minister, is very thoughtful on these issues, and it would be good to hear some of his reflections on how we deepen that cooperation. And finally this, I heard so many times in Ukraine over the weekend, as we have so many other times when we visit, thank you to us. It's the wrong way round. We should be saying thank you to Ukraine from all of us. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Kevin Bonavia.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We've heard some very powerful speeches from fellow members in this House. Those of us who are here in this chamber today are united in support of our friends in Ukraine. Members have spoken about their own experience of support. We've spoken about other members not in the chamber today who've also given the support. But remember this, there are members of the Rada Ukrainian Parliament who are doing far more than we could ever do, who are actually fighting the war there, who are on the hit lists on Putin's list. We here must show that resolve, because what we say in this chamber is not heard or watched just on the TVs of our constituents. It is watched by our allies and our adversaries. So what we say here does matter. We also know that our ally Ukraine doesn't just depend on words. They need the tools to carry on the job. And they must know that in this country they have no truer friend, and that we will be with them until the very end. Very happy to do so.
Thank you, my friend, for giving way. As we know, Russia is trying to destroy Ukrainian identity, and therefore I'm absolutely delighted that NEPSON, they're putting on a Ukrainian Friendship Week this month. So does my friend agree that it's absolutely vital that we provide the opportunity for Ukrainians in the UK to celebrate their culture here?
Absolutely, and the Honourable Lady makes a good point about the Ukrainians that we have given sanctuary to in this country. They are doing a fantastic contribution, and they should be proud of their identity, just as many of us, and I'm not doing it today, but many of us wear the Ukrainian flag alongside the Union Jack. They should be proud of it and never lose that identity, wherever their lives may take them. But going forward, the world must be clear about what this country's position is on the future of this horrific conflict. Yes, we want peace, but at not any price. And we must be clear that no peace can be made without the people of Ukraine. We have a proud history in this country of defending democracy, but we have blots on our history too. When we decided the future of Czechoslovakia without the Czechoslovaks, we cannot do that now, and we should urge our allies that they cannot do that either. And that has got to be at the heart of this government's policy. And beyond that, it is about the soft and the hard power. There are people out there talking about hard power politics out there. Now, I speak as a lawyer who believes in the rule of law. But law, without the power behind it, is just empty words. And so, I commend efforts by this government in increasing that hard power. This country is getting serious, and it needs to get more serious. So I'm sure there are many members in this House that will support the government do precisely that. Because if we do not, and if there is a peace, which is just a pause for Putin, we know what will happen next. Those Ukrainians are on the front line of Europe, and not just Europe. Make no mistake. This hostility goes right across the world to our allies across the Atlantic and beyond. Happily.
Thank him for giving way. He's right that the world should know and be in no doubt of the UK's position on Ukraine. But we should be in no doubt about Putin's ambitions either. He described as a geopolitical catastrophe the falling apart of the Soviet Union. And Russia's 800-year most modern history is one of almost relentless expansion. So for anybody to deny Putin's ambitions for territorial expansion, you have to deny both the statement and Russian history. Will you agree with me on that?
Absolutely. And we mustn't underestimate Putin, who's a clear student of history, but he draws the wrong lessons from it. That man was an agent, a KB agent, in Eastern Germany when the Berlin Wall fell. His world fell apart. He's now trying to rebuild that world. So it doesn't stop in Ukraine. It goes right across all those members of the then Warsaw Pact. I myself was a member of the Armed Forces scheme in Eastern Poland. And when I went there Eastern Poland last year, I saw our Typhoon jets being scrambled to check out a Russian plane right on the edge of that. This is happening day in, day out. So that man's ambitions has no borders. So what I urge this government to do is to be resolute, this House to be resolute, and this country to be resolute in defending the future of Ukraine, because their future is also our future. Thank you.
Anderson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to speak in this debate, and I just want to put out there to all members, we're potentially in the coming weeks or months going to be voting to put our troops in potentially harm's way. I have put a friend on the back of a Hercules in a coffin from a foreign conflict. It's not something I want to see. Supporting Ukraine, and I'm the only member of this House on the Ukraine-NATO Interparliamentary Council. I stand completely supportive of Ukraine, but that doesn't mean it's a given conclusion we are putting troops in harm's way. So we need to clearly set that out. And I want to talk about deployment from experience that I've had there. So I want to first look at two historic deployments, both of which I was on, in Bosnia and Kosovo, to set out some of the challenges it would be good if the Minister can set out later. So in Bosnia is 12 times smaller than Ukraine, and at the start there was 2,400 troops that increased to 11,500 troops during the mid-90s. And the size of the British Army then was 250,000. Not the Army, the Armed Forces was 250,000. In 1999, I was in Kosovo. That is 55 times smaller than Ukraine, and the number of troops, including standby, was 19,000. The size of the British Armed Forces was over 200,000. For reference, the British Armed Forces is today around 136,000, significantly less. It's been declining for 30 years. What would a deployment look like today? The numbers that we've seen, and I take it that no numbers have been disclosed formally, the numbers we've seen so far in the media are 7,500. 7,500 troops equates to 15,000 per 6-month period. You have 7,500 deployed, 7,500 on pre-deployment training, and over a 12-year period that would equate to 30,000 troops tied up, prepared or coming back from Ukraine, almost half of our army. That doesn't necessarily include naval and air assets that would need to be in the region, that will take up a significant commitment as well. So if we're looking at a stabilisation in some way, shape or form of British troops on a peace deal, and bearing in mind we have all stated today that Putin does not respect international law. We do not believe he wants peace. If he says, I'm going to have peace, you put British troops right on his border and he changes his mind or reneges on any deal, that's something we seriously have to consider. And if you're looking at 39 million Ukrainian residents, the rule of sort of military deployment, and the Armed Forces Minister will know, on a stabilisation force, you're looking at a peacekeeping role of 20 to 25 troops per 1,000 residents that would equate to 600 to 800,000 troops, roughly the size of the Ukrainian armed forces. So I ask, what are our 7,500 and France's 7,500 going to do with a highly capable Ukrainian military that's been there for a long time? So there is a cost to this, and I would really like to understand what considerations and what information will be made available over the coming weeks and months, because this will be a hot topic. But how are we planning for a withdrawal, as well as we're planning to put troops in there? We must have a clear, coherent strategy of how our troops will operate, for how long and what commitment. Why are we looking to operate outside of NATO or JEF? Both Bosnia and Kosovo were NATO missions. We have that framework, and I'm very concerned the coalition of the willing will not be working coherently as the JEF does with NATO. How is this deployment going to be funded? Because even this week, CDS has said there are in-year pressures, and if cuts are not made, they will exceed the budget, which they're not allowed to do. So I have concerns with that. The rules of engagement of Putin does not respect any international law. How are our troops protected, not just short term, but long term? And these are questions that we should be early on bringing to this House, but without a major intervention from the government for funding and increase, we need at least a brigade strength more to put this level of troops into that region. With what we have in the UK Armed Forces, on the sick and deployable, that's what we would need to do this. And without a major intervention from the government, we do not, I believe, have the current operational capability to have a sustainable conflict or peacekeeping forces over in Ukraine at this time.
Richard Baker.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I had the privilege of joining a parliamentary delegation to the YES conference in Kiev in September. That conference came at the very moment of the incursion of Russian drones into Polish airspace, reminding us that it is far from only the future of Ukraine which is at stake. Their fight is ours and it is Europe's. And at the conference, the Foreign Secretary, on her first international visit in that role, announced 100 sanctions against Russia and, crucially, £142 million to support civilians in frontline communities. I want to focus my brief remarks on the importance of humanitarian support, for some of those in Ukraine's civilian community who have been most acutely affected and harmed, but whose experiences and voices need to be more widely heard. When Russia brutally invaded Ukraine in 2022, millions of people were forced to flee, but to leave their homes has not been an option for many disabled people, and not for more than 260,000 Ukrainian people with learning disabilities dependent on their families. Their carers, they had to stay in the midst of the invasion. Missile and drone attacks are terrifying for the whole community, but particularly for autistic people and those with learning disabilities. Raisa Kravchenko has been at the forefront of supporting and protecting disabled people over these past traumatic years. And on my visit to Kiev, I met with Raisa and her colleague Yulia Klepets. They founded the all-Ukrainian NGO coalition for persons with intellectual disabilities. They told me how Raisa spent 25 days sheltering in a basement with her son Alexei, who has a learning disability, without food, without electricity or gas, how support and coping strategies parents have used to support their children have been wrecked by the invasion. They told me of Vitaly Segalev, who had not left his Kiev apartment in 3 years, was so terrified by air raid sirens, wholly dependent on his mother. This took a toll on his health and safety, and Vitaly died. These are war crimes for which Russia must be held accountable. Before the invasion, Raisa and Yulia were campaigning to move more disabled people out of care institutions into community support. That work has been utterly frustrated, and indeed now disabled people in care institutions have been targeted by Russian forces for kidnapping, as highlighted in the vital report by my honourable friend, the member for Paisley and Renfrewshire herself. The disabled community in Ukraine is at breaking point and beyond. We are providing support. £25 million from the UK government for the Spirit programme is welcome. It will provide support including for disabled children. But we have to do much more, to go further, and the international community needs to do more to intervene in a human rights emergency for disabled people, as with so many other groups within Ukrainian society. And I'm keen to engage further with colleagues in government on these issues, alongside the All Ukraine Coalition, Inclusion Europe and UK Friends of Ukraine. I've published a report on the impact of the invasion on disabled people, which I hope will help Parliament consider what more we can do here to support this community of Ukrainian people who have been so badly affected. The experience of disabled people is just one aspect of the crimes committed against the people of Ukraine. We must look to the prospect for a peace agreement, but at this moment in time we have to ensure we're doing all we can to support Ukraine militarily and in terms of the humanitarian need as well, including for disabled people and for those who provide care and support. Raisa, Yulia and their colleagues, their resilience is awe-inspiring. Their lives have been devastated for the sake of Putin's ambitions. And we must understand the scale of the task of reconstruction, estimated at $1 trillion. We have to hold Russia accountable for that. They must be penalised financially to ensure we can support a full reconstruction, support all of the communities who've been so badly affected and harmed because of Russia's illegal actions. And we must do all we can to intervene in this humanitarian crisis.
Martin Wrigley.
Madam Deputy Speaker, like many in this House, I stand with Ukraine and its defence of the front line of Europe. I'm proud to do so. A couple of weeks ago, I was helping some of the local Ukrainians we have in the Homes for Ukraine scheme move home. And they were being visited by their father, who is a senior officer in the Ukrainian Navy. He was very, very grateful for the fact that we were keeping his family safe, and he said how important it was to the Ukrainians that we were able to do so. However, there are still some things that we need to do to ensure their safety remains here in the UK. One of his daughters had just applied for the extension for the Homes for Ukraine, the Ukrainian Permission Extension Scheme, which you can only apply for 28 days before your visa runs out. She had been waiting more than 28 days. She was worried that without a visa she would not be able to stay. I asked the government to look at enabling renewal of those visas sooner than 28 days before the end. Now, last year I was able to win an extra 2 years for Ukrainians to actually gain and stay here on those visas, which was fantastic, and I thank the government for doing that. However, we still don't know how that is going to work. and whether we'll still have this 28-day problem and they have to wait right up to the very end. Now, none of the Ukrainians I know in the UK are sitting back and waiting for help. They have all gone out and got jobs, they're starting businesses, they're doing things, they're rebuilding lives here. And we need to look at how we can make that work. One of the issues for this family was qualifications. Their daughter had highly rated qualifications in maths and physics from the Ukrainian school that was not recognised by the school in the UK. It would be helpful if the government could provide guidance to our schools to actually what extent they can recognise the qualifications from Ukrainian schools for the students who are here. That was one of their explicit asks. I add into that we should be looking at what we can do in terms of dentistry. I have a Ukrainian dentist in my constituency. He is going through an elongated process to try to re-qualify to practice dentistry in the UK, and goodness knows, we need all the dentists we can get. Let's help them. Let's make it easier for them to settle here for longer. Now, there is a problem with the Ukrainian Permissions Extension Scheme that if Donald Trump were to be able to magic a ceasefire out of thin air, which I feel, this House feels probably, is very, very unlikely, we then have a position where we technically have peace in Ukraine, potentially. I dream for that day. I don't expect it to be soon. However, if we have peace, we know that the Ukrainian visas will be ended, will finish, and we will be expecting people to go back. But we all know there's a difference between peace and safe. We know that Ukraine is covered in unexploded ordnance and landmines, which could take up to 40 years to clear, and a land that could gain peace, but it won't be safe. I have a lady in my constituency whose village is in the Russian-occupied zone. Her village has been demolished, her house is rubble. She's lost her husband, lost her brother, lost her father. She's got nothing to go back to. I want to make sure that we look for settlement in the long term. Now, Ukraine has recently changed its law to allow people to hold second passports. The UK is not on that list yet of countries with that agreement. I urge the government to look at that, to ensure that we have a process towards long-term settlement in the UK, so that those industrious Ukrainians who have started businesses can actually thrive and develop and not only contribute to our economy, but can contribute to Ukraine's rebuilding. There are many things that we can do. I applaud the government for all that it's doing, but we can do more. Please help them to help themselves and help us. Slava Ukraini.
Tom Hayes.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Before I start my contribution, I want to acknowledge your own staunch, consistent support for the people of Ukraine, most recently representing the Speaker at the International Crimea platform to reinforce Ukraine's sovereignty. My heart goes out to the people of Ukraine, both in Ukraine and in Bournemouth itself. I commend Ukrainian Relief, who have a donation centre at Castle Point Shopping Centre in my constituency, and the work of Karol Swiacki and other Ukrainians across Bournemouth. Whether the peace that President Trump creates is durable will depend on whether he applies sufficient pressure to Vladimir Putin to secure it. And we don't yet know the final outline of a peace deal or even a ceasefire, but we do know that the Trump administration has pressed Ukraine before to make concessions. Granted a summit with President Trump in Alaska, Putin instead demanded more territory than he had already seized in his war of aggression to date, and the administration responded not by pressuring Russia, but by putting more pressure onto Ukraine. Arms were withheld, intelligence was withdrawn, assistance that remained was limited and slow. Kyiv has been left perpetually uncertain about the reliability of US support. Now, with the offer of a 15-year US security guarantee as part of a peace plan, that should give us room for pause too. 15 years will go by in the blink of an eye, unless a guarantee is exceptionally robust and unless the armed forces of Europe's democracies, ours included, are integral to enforcing it. Otherwise, I fear that Moscow will wait, it will rebuild, and it will return when the clock runs out. We need to be, as the Honourable Member for South Shropshire was saying, mindful about what a deployment looks like and be asking those serious questions. And I know that the Prime Minister, a good man, a serious man, a patriotic man, having to deal with the insanity that is abroad and having to deal with difficult conditions at home, is charting the course as best that he and this government can. And I know that he puts the safety of British troops at the heart of what he does. Because without genuine stability, Ukraine cannot rebuild in peace. Boardrooms will not make investments over the long term. We know too that this would not be peace, it would be merely a ceasefire, a temporary pause. And with the temptation to renew aggression, one that we know Putin can't resist, brutish competition for continental dominance would define this decade and sadly the next. So we have to be keeping the peace as well as making it. And really the only way we can do that is through security guarantees that are robust. And unfortunately, this does mean that we need to come to terms with a changed world. We've not known this fear before. We've not known this fear for a long time. The feeling that Ukraine knows every single day in its bones. Uniquely, the United States has been the richest and most capable country in world history. Yet nations haven't chosen to balance against it, they've chosen to ally with it. It's been a reversal of all that we've known in history. And that's because America sought collective security, self-determination, open trade, institutions, legitimacy, purposeful democracy. But today, that strategic capital is being diminished consciously as a matter of policy by the Trump administration. Not everywhere in the US security apparatus, it should be said, but at the highest level where political decisions are being taken. I've lived in America, I've travelled it widely, I've had the privilege of studying international security at one of its universities, and I have a deep affection for its dynamism and its democracy. But we must also face the fact that, looking at the national security strategy, Ukraine and Europe are less of a priority than other parts of the world. And so European defence planners have to be spending our days tracking Russian troop movements, calculating whether Putin might order an attack on a NATO member before the end of the decade, as he did against Ukraine, and wondering whether the United States will come to our defence. We need to be rearming, we need to be doing it faster, we need to be improving and significantly increasing our weapons manufacture, and we need to be moving closer to European democracies, not the EU per se in defence and security, which may be too inflexible, but our European democratic friends, our like-minded friends who care about peace, care about democracy, and will themselves put forward a programme of rearmament too. And I'll close in saying this. We also need to recognise that in facing the world as it is, and in trying to rearm and increase our diplomatic influence to meet it, there will be people in our country who do not like this. We see in France, we see in Germany the rise of the far right and the populist right, and they are seeking to make an issue about rearmament. We here in this House need to be united. We know there are those on the benches opposite who, not in attendance today, will protest our rearmament and our commitment to Ukraine. We in this House need to be united behind Ukraine, democracy and peace, and we need as best we can not to play party politics, but to rebuild that consensus that lasted for so many, many years, but seems to me to be at threat today.
Sir John Whittingdale.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I have spoken about Ukraine and indeed initiated debates on Ukraine a number of times over the past 12 years, which of course was when the war which Russia is waging on Ukraine started with the annexation of Crimea. And during that time I visited Avdiivka, Mariupol, Berdyansk, all of which are now under Russian occupation. I'm proud that as a result of pressing the government at that time, the UK started supporting Ukraine through Operation Orbital. This was before the full-scale Russian invasion, but since then we have been in the vanguard. We've done so because we have a duty as an original signatory of the Budapest Memorandum, because we also believe in the principle that independent sovereign states should not lose territory as a result of military aggression, but also because Ukraine is our front line, because we know that Putin's threat does not just extend to the territory of Ukraine, but to all of those countries which used to be either part of the Soviet Union or the Warsaw Pact, in particular the Baltic states. But I'm more proud of the extraordinary resilience and courage shown by the Ukrainian people. People have talked about in this debate about the fact that it's going to be minus 16 tonight, that 70% of Kyiv has no electricity, as does large parts of Odessa, Kharkiv, a number of other cities. And the losses during this war on both sides have been truly horrendous. Well over 1 million Russian casualties. And on the Ukrainian side, although numbers have not been released, it's almost certainly well over 100,000. So we can understand why the Ukrainians want to see an end to this war. But they want a just and lasting peace. And therefore, the original plan that was advanced by
Steve Witkoff and President Trump, the so-called 28-point plan, was utterly unacceptable. It required Ukraine to accept the loss of their territory. It required Ukraine to commit never to having NATO troops on their soil. The plan that is apparently now coming forward is, we are told by President Zelensky, 90% in agreement, but he's described as the requirements on territory as being very difficult. And whilst I absolutely believe that it must be for Ukraine to decide on the terms of any peace, the idea that Russia is going to be allowed to keep any of the sovereign territory of Ukraine is very, very difficult to stomach. We have debated the terms of a potential peace plan involving the deployment of troops as a security guarantee, and I absolutely share some of the concerns about how that will operate that have been expressed by a number of other speakers in the debate. But my real concern is that whilst it is important we do talk about how a settlement might be enforced, I do believe that there is a very strong chance we're not going to get one. Because Sergei Lavrov has said within the last 24 hours that a ceasefire is simply not serious. And since talk of this peace plan was advanced, Russia has stepped up its attack, that the number of drones and missiles landing across the whole of Ukraine has simply gone on increasing. And there is a real risk that actually, as if part of the settlement plan involves the stationing of NATO troops on Ukrainian soil, as we have been debating. Putin has made it absolutely clear that that is a complete red line, which he is not willing to accept. So I think we need to at least prepare ourselves for the fact that this war is going to go on for a long time. In which case, I say to the Minister, where is Plan B? And Plan B has to involve much tougher action against Russia. It needs to involve seizing Russian assets, stopping trade with Russia. It means arming Ukraine to an extent that has not been possible. And I welcome the recent announcements, things like Project Nightfall in the last week or so, where we will be supplying Ukraine with long-range missiles. In terms of assets, very quickly, the Foreign Affairs Committee this morning heard from the Chief Executive of the Chelsea Humanitarian Fund and representatives of the legal firm advising them about the difficulties in achieving what we all want to see, which is the use of the money from Chelsea Football Club to support Ukraine. I would simply say to the Minister, would he please meet them, because there are some serious legal obstacles, and they said that they have a solution to those, but they are anxious to have the opportunity to discuss it further with the Minister. But I will end by simply saying, I would love to think that this war is going to come to an end soon, and my friends in Ukraine pray for that every night. But let us be prepared for the fact that this may go on for much longer, and that we are going to need to do a lot more to put pressure on Russia to get them to stop.
John Slinger.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I've spoken consistently about the need to protect the international rules-based system. It's a system not only under direct and indirect threat throughout the world, but in Ukraine it has clearly failed insofar as Russia invaded. And this is a moment not to jettison it, but to redouble our defence of it, as we did in the past. Britain has a proud track record in the world wars, the Cold War, the liberation of the Falkland Islands, of Kuwait and latterly Iraq, our actions in Bosnia and Herzegovina, Kosovo, and indeed the no-fly zone in northern Iraq. In each case, we defended brave victims against bullies. We used military force to uphold the rights of nations and of human beings. But we know that intervention has a checkered history. Arguably, Madam Deputy Speaker, the warlords and government and some dubious governments noticed the abject failure of the international community to prevent the genocide in Rwanda. And even in cases where we took military action, others watched and drew conclusions. Malevolent actors around the world must have looked upon the former Yugoslavia and noticed that 250,000 civilians were killed before the international community got truly serious, with American leadership finally ensuring that NATO took decisive action. And need I say that Saddam Hussein got away with breaching every known international law before the Americans, this country and others belatedly took action. Belated tough action, feeble action, or the absence of action, which is itself an action, each have profound consequences. In the case of Syria, many people forget that Russia's move to consolidate its strategic military influence in that country only happened at pace once the West and the international community had signalled they would not enforce the most basic of red lines against Assad for using chemical weapons. Surely that must have emboldened Russia in other parts of the world, such as Ukraine, a point made by my honourable friend, the member for Hemel Hempstead. Despite the excellent efforts of the British military and diplomatic machines in Ukraine, which did ramp up military and other support long before 2022, and which I commend, it was self-evidently, and with hindsight we can say, insufficient. I've always been hugely reassured by the almost universal cross-party nature of this Parliament's steadfast support for Ukraine, Parliament at its best. But at this crucial moment, we must do everything that we can to ensure that the sacrifice of Ukrainian soldiers and civilians is not in vain. More generally, we must make sure that the rules-based system doesn't wither on the vine. And I want to bring my comments towards my constituency, where there are two home fronts at work. Our own here among British citizens. It's crucial that they realise just what's at stake. It's not an exaggeration to say that if we get this wrong, or if we don't get it sufficiently right, war will come ever closer to these shores. And the public are going to have to make sacrifices, because that's what's needed to defend democracy. And then the extended Ukrainian home front in communities like mine in Rugby, where families, schools and businesses have welcomed them as they flee conflict. This is being supported by civil servants nationally, and especially the settlement teams in places like Warwickshire County Council, and they do excellent work and compassionate work alongside their district council colleagues, charities, volunteers, and most importantly, our citizens. And it's supported by community groups like the Ukrainians in Great Britain Rugby branch, whose work I have seen. This is Britain at its best, living up to our values of welcoming those in need. In conclusion, Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to share with you some direct testimony from Ukrainian families who've been in touch with me this week, and I quote, "Russia is systematically targeting the energy system, using hundreds of drones and missiles. Radiators go cold and water freezes in the pipes. People no longer live by the clock, but by the moments when electricity briefly returns. Children do their homework at night. Parents cook food in the dark hours. Civilian life is the target, not military locations. The aim is to break people, to exhaust them, to destroy society from within. And then there are the night attacks, sirens, explosions, and constant fear. They don't let you sleep. Your body is tired, but your mind stays awake, waiting for the next sound. This is what it does to your mental state. You live in constant anxiety. You're always on the edge. Even in silence, you are listening. Supporting Ukraine's energy system, its air defence and its logistics is not abstract assistance. It is the simplest and most effective way to save millions of lives and to prevent a new humanitarian catastrophe in Europe." And I end the quote. There's a lot at stake, but as this government have made very clear, we will not turn our back on Ukraine, quite the reverse. We are going to strengthen international law and the rules-based system, which in conjunction with military power keeps us, our allies and the wider world safe.
Members will be interested now. I'm going to call the front benches at 22. There are 4 speakers in 12 minutes. Dr. Caroline Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, 4 years ago when Putin invaded Ukraine, people around this country opened their hearts and their homes to Ukrainian people. And I thank them for the generosity, particularly those in my constituency of Sleaford and North Hykeham, who welcomed people to their homes, who supported them and who continue to support them to this day. There are just over 1,000 people from Ukraine, according to latest council figures in Lincolnshire. And I want to focus on them today. I met a group just last weekend, Madam Deputy Speaker, in Sleaford, who are led by Kelly Bryslin and Betty Borsland, who I would like to thank for their work in trying to bring the community together and to help them navigate various different systems within the British state. I met women, predominantly, children, an accountant, a doctor, a dentist. I met a masseuse who set up her own business in my constituency. Firstly, they were grateful to the British state and to the former Prime Minister Boris Johnson for his work in supporting them and their country. They were thankful to the people who'd supported them as their hosts. They told me of their trips out of Ukraine and the fear that many of them felt. I met 2 young ladies who were just 18 when they left as friends together to come across to live with a family in Ruskington, and thought of my own child of similar age and thinking, how would it be to let that daughter go across to another country, to an unknown, to live with an unknown family in such circumstances. They told me about the cultural and language challenges that they had, and one of them told me about her recent visit to Ukraine at Christmas and the 5 days of power outage that they had there and the difficulties and fear that she had going back for that short period. One lady explained about how life was on hold. When they first came, they were quite content just to be safe, just to have no fear of bombs. But as time goes by, they think of the jobs that they had and the careers that they had and the futures they want to have and the difficulties that they have at the moment in progressing them. So, for example, one young lady talked about the training challenges. If she wants to do an apprenticeship, she can't do an apprenticeship because her visa doesn't last long enough for her to do an apprenticeship. If she wants to do a university course or a training course, she has a similar problem. The 28-day period by which someone has to, if someone is wanting to stay and they have to apply for a new visa, they cannot apply until 28 days before they're due to leave, which also causes problems with employment, and they were all very, very keen to work. I also want to ask the Minister specifically about people who are in medical profession, dentists and doctors, because it seems to me we have a shortage of both. For example, Madam Deputy Speaker, the cardiothoracic waiting list is not just going up last month, it went up last month, it's gone up the last year, and it's higher than it was when we left office. And yet we have in my constituency a cardiothoracic surgeon who's unable to practice currently and is working in a factory instead. So I asked the Minister if he could, I appreciate the time is very, very short and I'm not able to go through all the examples I would have liked to, but if he was able to write to me or ask the relevant Minister to write to me with the various schemes available for people with skills to be able to utilise them to their fullest whilst they're in the country. Thank you.
Richard Ford.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I want to speak briefly about Russian intent, the coalition of the willing, and sanctions on Russia. And I'll, of course, do so using open source reporting and analysis. But first up, I want to praise the courage and determination of the Ukrainian people because, of course, it is to them that we look to for our own safety. This is not an exaggeration. And I think it's worth articulating what we mean when we say Putin won't stop at Ukraine. Putin has previous experience in invading Georgia, Crimea, Moldova. There is the legacy of conflict in Kievan Rus and in what now these days Russia refers to as Ruski Mir, meaning the so-called Russian world, that part of the world which is Russian culture, Russian speaking. Indeed, 25% of Estonia, 25% of Latvia have Russian ethnic people. So we have NATO members that have ethnic Russians living in them, and it is to them that we must look for the defence of Europe. Of course, we must think about the coalition of the willing that the government was talking about last week. And I've asked frequently about security guarantees for Ukraine, but I am still uncertain about the purpose of this proposed deployment. We've heard the term reassurance, but we've also heard words like peacekeeping. Is it for peacekeeping? Is it peace enforcement? Is it deterrence? Is it defence? Is it a tripwire? A little bit more information would be needed, I suppose, before this House was to vote on what is meant by the coalition of the willing. Of course, the West has successfully called Putin's bluff repeatedly. We did so when we provided armour, such as Challenger 2. We did so when we provided fighter jets, such as the F-16. We did so when we provided deep strike weapons, such as Storm Shadow. But the deployment of British troops is different because of ambiguity over what the West would do if they were targeted. Now, I accept that this might be intentional. I accept that we might practice deliberate ambiguity, but just as we have deliberate ambiguity, Russia tends to use plausible deniability. The former Defence Secretary said on the radio last week that we could see a situation where there is an attack on British troops that is claimed by Russia to be the work of separatists within Ukraine, or indeed even a false flag operation. I appreciate that if this does ever come to a vote, that we will get an opportunity to have a much more extensive debate on that. But those are my comments on the coalition of the willing for today. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Chris Coughlin.
Madam Deputy Speaker. Last year in Ukraine, a Ukrainian MP told me that her husband had served on the front line for 8 years. She asked me if, in the event of a peace agreement, I would support British ground troops. And I, of course, have questions about British ground troops, but I said that I would, and that I'm also potentially liable to serve myself. As a reservist soldier, I am proud to be under the same obligations to serve as any British soldier. Yeah. Because we live in times of enormous peril and we have a responsibility to lead. We are threatened in the East by dictators and in the West by autocrats. Indeed, it is an open question whether liberal democracy will succeed in this century as it did in the last. But Ukraine has been bearing the brunt of this fight, and its sacrifice has brought us time. But Ukraine still has a credible path to a just peace. European NATO GDP alone is 10 times the size of Russia's. Yet Russia has been spending $40 billion more a year on the war in Ukraine than Ukraine and her Western allies. If we closed and exceeded that gap today by seizing the $300 billion in frozen Russian assets, then not only could Ukraine secure a just peace, but we would also deter Putin from crashing into Eastern Europe and testing Article 5. With President Trump disgracefully threatening NATO allies as well, smaller democracies must also ensure that we are economically and militarily strong enough to defend ourselves together. It is the example of the United States, a country that I love, that can show us how. In the 1940s, refugees fled the Nazis to the United States, they built the atomic bomb, and they won the war. In the process, they developed a method of public research and development that academics now acknowledge has powered US technological and economic dominance ever since. The Chancellor's recognised this. In the spring statement, she used the $2.2 billion increase in defence research and development to upgrade long-term UK GDP growth by $11 billion a year. The current and former presidents of the European Central Bank have called on Europe to borrow to invest in defence research and development, not only to deter Russia, but also to lift Europe out of the economic stagnation that has held the continent back and the United Kingdom since the financial crash in 2008. We can do this too. Madam Deputy Speaker, President Reagan described America as a beacon on the hill. Sadly, it appears that that light is now fading, but I believe it has burnt long enough for the other democracies to see it. So now it is up to us, the smaller democracies, to ensure that we are also humanity's best last hope.
Briefly.
Speaker, a serious concern shared by Ukrainians in Wokingham is the crimes of the Russian army. Over 20,000 children abducted since the start of Russia's invasion. This is a disgusting tactic of the Russian armed forces, authorised by Putin, which threatens to rob Ukraine of its future. I would like to know from the Minister, does the government recognise that these massive abductions constitute war crimes? And will the government hold Putin to account for these crimes by implementing the outstanding International Criminal Court arrest warrant against him? It is not just Putin who has been shown to be a bad actor in all of this. My constituents in Wokingham write to me all the time to express their disgust of Trump's behaviour, whether it's bullying Zelensky in the White House or extorting this vulnerable country of their minerals. The President has acted shamefully. If Ukraine cannot rely on Trump, then Europe must be all the more united in their support of Ukraine. Trump has shown time and time again that he does not care about international rules and obligations and is more interested in cozying up to autocrats and increasing the coffers of the wider Trump family. Threatening to invade Greenland is the latest proof that Trump is not pro-democracy and cannot be trusted by the international community. Clearly, the government has to focus on joining with our European neighbours to support our friends' territory and their way of life, and not just Ukraine. If we don't do this, history tells us the aggressor will turn their attention to the UK, which is a situation we really do not want to happen.
Brings us to the front bench contributions. Shadow Minister David Reid.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I think to start, and to raise the point that the Shadow Minister raised in his opening speech, we are at a major crossroad in this conflict, and the stakes could not be higher. On the line is Ukraine's sovereignty, the freedom of its people, and the wider security of Europe. Madam Deputy Speaker, in truth, the security of all of us. I think it's easy in this House to speak in abstractions such as the rules-based order, hybrid threats or deterrence. But the reality is brutally concrete. When Russia is allowed to advance by force, the consequences do not remain on the eastern flank. They spill into energy markets, cyber attacks, disinformation and sabotage. And most importantly, they shape the calculations of every hostile actor watching to see what the West will tolerate. We all know that Russia is waging a sustained and hostile campaign against all of us. We must therefore be prepared for long-term tension. But the outcome of the war in Ukraine remains central to dealing a decisive blow to that wider threat. I think to touch on a number of the points that we've heard from honourable and right honourable members from across this House today, I think kicking off with the Chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, who spoke very powerfully about the lion heart and the Ukrainian resolve. She talked about the day-to-day life of Ukrainian people and how they've been attacked repeatedly by this brutal regime in Russia. She talked about energy and the barbaric nature that the regime under Putin is forcing upon the Ukrainian people, and it needs to stop. She also raised a number of points around the shadow fleets, which I will come on to in later comments. The Lib Dem spokesperson, the honourable member for Lewes, raised an important question around deployments of British troops to Ukraine. I'm looking forward to hearing the Shadow Minister's response to those points. The honourable member for Hemel Hempstead talked about an almost unified position across this House with the exception of a few parties. And I really hope those parties that don't support that unified approach take a long, hard look in the mirror and work out whose side they're actually on. I also want to align myself with his words around the Defence Secretary, the former Defence Secretary, Sir Ben Wallace. He did really play a decisive role in those early few years of the Ukrainian war. The Father of the House, my right honourable friend, the member for Gainsborough, raised the point that Ukraine's fight is our fight, a point that I think we mainly agree on. We cannot consider giving Putin territory that he has failed to capture over the past 4 years. The honourable member for Paisley and Renfrewshire South talked very powerfully about the 20,000 stolen Ukrainian children. I think to try and put that into context, 20 schools worth of children being taken over the Russian border. It's a disgusting and almost inconceivable practice, and we must not allow the world to forget what the Russian regime has done under Putin. My right honourable friend for Harwich and North Essex, he's raised the issue of Ukraine numerous times now over the last few years. And I think we can all agree that when he speaks, everyone listens. The diplomatic efforts that he raised that Russia are trying to push along now are so intense because I think they have worked out that militarily they cannot win. We know that that's the rule of the game now, so we must increase pressure on them and play them at their own game. The chair of the Ukraine APPG, the honourable member for Leeds Central and Headingley, talked about the pressure that Ukrainians are currently under, and again referred back to heat and energy. And I want to thank him for the work that he's done to connect Ukrainian MPs with members from across this Parliament. The honourable member for Arbroath and Broughty Ferry, I know how cold it gets in Arbroath. So when he says that it gets down to -20 and it's a bit nippy, I know that he speaks from experience. The honourable member for Stevenage, he has mentioned a number of important points around the fact that we all want peace, but it cannot be peace at any cost. And that's a point that we must continue to discuss. My honourable friend, the member for South Shropshire, a former soldier and a member of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, raised the really important questions, and this is the nuts and the bolts of the politics that will go forward. And I will raise that later on in my speech around troop deployments. There's also been a number of valuable insights and contributions from the honourable member for Glenrothes and Mid-Fife, my constituency neighbour, albeit separated by an estuary in Newton Abbot, the member for Bournemouth East, my right honourable friend from Malden, and again, someone who's done a great deal for Ukraine over the years. The honourable member for Rugby, the Right Honourable Member for Sleaford and North Hykeham talked about the generosity of her constituents and welcoming Ukrainians into their homes, and I think that's a story that we've heard across all of our constituencies. The Honourable Member and again my constituency neighbour from Honiton and Sidmouth, a member of the Intelligence and Security Committee, he talked very powerfully about Russian intent. The Honourable Member for Dorking and Hawley, and I think we all can say thank you very much for your service and your willingness to deploy if there is a deployment to Ukraine. And then lastly, the Honourable Member for Wokingham talked about war crimes, and again, a point that we need to remember and we need to enforce once there is a peace. Madam Deputy Speaker, we all want this war to end, but we've seen delay, obfuscation and maximalist demands from Putin when it comes to peace. A familiar strategy designed to divide allies and buy time. So I say to ministers, pursue diplomacy, of course, but do so with your eyes wide open. As Churchill warned, you cannot negotiate with a tiger when your head is in its mouth. And I think this is a very important point, that a weak settlement, if it's reached, simply starts the clock on rearmament. Putin will not stop. As has always been the case, it is for Ukraine to decide its own future, and any settlement must involve Ukraine and is to secure a just and lasting peace under their terms. What matters most is that Putin cannot emerge strengthened. Conceding territory rewards aggression and sets a dangerous precedent far beyond Europe. Nor should Putin's regime be welcomed back into the international fold as this was some sort of misunderstanding. This is a war of choice, an imperial project, and Putin has not abandoned his ambition to subjugate Ukraine. This brings me to sanctions, assets and energy, where rhetoric must now become action. Although we welcome the £2.26 billion loan taken from Ukraine profits from immobilised Russian sovereign assets, I do believe that we need to go further, and a number of those points have been drawn out today already. There have been a number of points raised around the Russian shadow fleets, and I welcome the reports that the government are exploring a clearer legal basis to detain stateless vessels. But what matters now is resolve. Sanctions that are not enforced are not sanctions at all. They are merely suggestions. And as the Minister opposite, and I know all too well, Britain has world-class maritime forces in both the Royal Marines and Special Forces, with near unrivalled experience in complex border operations. We should be working with allies to deter and disrupt and degrade this Russian fleet. I also think, and I'm conscious of time, that there are a number of unfolding situations that are linked to Ukraine. Iran and the regime currently in power has been funding the Ukrainian war. And if the Minister can give a few words to the unfolding situation and UK troops being taken out from Middle Eastern bases. Just a really quick point, Madam Speaker. I visited the United States shortly before Christmas, and a congressman made a point to me that should land in every European capital. Americans cannot care more about European security than Europeans care about their own security. The gap between ambition and readiness cannot be closed by speeches, and we've heard already the comments from the Chief of the General Staff today about the separation between the Strategic Defence Review and the need to increase defence spending. We must now match moral clarity, Madam Deputy Speaker, with seriousness. Putin will not stop because we ask. He will stop when he is made to stop. This is the moment to get real and do the right thing. We stand with Ukraine, and we will ensure Ukraine wins the peace as well as the war.
Minister,
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm grateful to the Honourable and Right Honourable members for their thoughtful and really considered contributions today, and for their continued commitment to a free and sovereign Ukraine. It's just worth pausing and noting that Russia now has been at war with Ukraine longer than it was involved in World War II. And just last month, there were 35,000 Russian casualties. Just think about that. 35,000 Russian casualties. So when we talk about planning, we talk about plans, we talk about regeneration, we talk about capabilities, it is not lost on the Ministry of Defence, it is not lost on this government the severity of the situation in Ukraine. As we approach the 4th anniversary, and indeed the 5th year of fighting since Putin's illegal full-scale invasion, and as we intensify work towards a just and lasting peace, it is our collective commitment and our unity that sends the strongest message to Kyiv and the Kremlin, that we, the United Kingdom and Northern Ireland, stand with Ukraine. I say this gently. Be wary of the words we say in this House, because they are interpreted very differently in Moscow. And so, yes, we have to be honest to the democratic process, but we must be also recognise the second and third order implications of what we say here and how that reverberates around the world. And when we said, for as long as it takes, we meant for as long as it takes. So before I address the question raised in today's debate, I want to be clear. Ukraine's security remains our security, as so many members have said today. And without a just and lasting peace in Ukraine, Europe is less secure and the UK, Madam Deputy Speaker, is less secure. Which is why we've been at the forefront of international efforts on both sides of the House to increase pressure on Putin's war machine and seize the opportunity to secure a just and lasting peace. That has arisen from President Trump's commitment to the end of the war. And it is why we will continue to do all we can to put Ukraine in the strongest possible position to secure that peace and sustain it. I appreciate the support from our approach that is echoed almost from all aspects of the House today, and I'll try to address the questions raised by honourable and right honourable members. The honourable member from Lewes talked through security guarantees. May I reassure the honourable member that our Chief of Defence Staff, our Secretary of State for Defence and our Prime Minister have worked tirelessly to deliver and hopefully put in place the security guarantees. That's really important because it's linked to peace and force posture. No security guarantees, no peace, and indeed no force posture. They are all intrinsically linked. I would also like to reassure that our ability to generate the force, prepare the force, deploy the force, and sustain and then reconstitute the force, I have complete and utter confidence in our military to do so if they are asked. The honourable member from Hemel Hempstead brought up an excellent point. He brought up the point in sum that says history doesn't repeat itself, but it sure does rhyme. Georgia, Chechnya 1, Chechnya 2, Syria, Libya, Ukraine, Ukraine again. This is a repeat and a consistency that Russia is showing to disregard, in all ways, shapes or forms, the historical norms that were put in place after the Second World War. And I also welcome his comments to say that Ukraine unites us all, and it's above politics, which I think is one of the greatest strengths of this House. The father of the House and the retired honourable member from Gainsborough, I completely empathise with what you're saying, and I can absolutely support that there is no braver forces than those standing in front of the Russian machine. What I would say that I would never ask someone to do something I wouldn't do myself. And if I believe our way of life is under threat or that of our allies, then I would happily go to the front. The honourable member from Paisley and Renfrewshire South, can I just commend from all members of the House the sterling work you have done to highlight the plight of 20,000 children and indeed put in place the process to return them to their rightful home. It is worth noting this is Russian doctrine in action. We are dealing with a barbaric nation that has part of its doctrine to steal, kidnap and re-educate large swathes of the population. We're just seeing it playing out in Ukraine. The honourable member from Harwich in North Essex raises a very valid point, and it links to the details of the operational plan. There is a time, a place of where we need to talk and discuss cross-party of what that looks like. To do the detail in here would be nothing other to give the advantage indeed to our adversary. And I also welcome his comments about armchair generals. I have full confidence in our generals, in our admirals and our air vice marshals and marshals to deliver when tasked. We must ensure that we don't apply political pressure on them to such an extent that we end up with politicised advice. And I would also agree that the inability to vote on Syria actually emboldened Russia and result in a whole cascade of events that you could argue, if you played this game back in Ukraine, leads back to some of those decisions in the first place. The honourable friend from Stevenage, I agree completely with his view that Ukraine must be at the centre of any negotiations. And again, my honourable friend from South Shropshire, I deeply respect his gallant insight and understanding. But what I would say is just about language. Right on his border, numbers, rotation, peace support, operations, peacekeeping, comparisons with the Balkans. Language really matters when we're talking about military tactics and doctrine, and it's really important. And it's our job in government to ensure those members with a vested interest understand that detail when the time is right, so we can represent it correctly in the House. But again, I have complete faith in our military leadership. And the honourable member from Glenrothes and Mid-Fife, I commend absolutely his work on supporting for disability inclusion within Ukraine. To sum up some of the questions, and I'll allude to some of them later on later on my speech, the honourable member from Exmouth and Exeter, the peace negotiations is not down to us. It is down to the Ukrainians. We are enabling and supporting, but the Ukrainians must be at the centre, the very centre of gravity of those negotiations, and we are supporting them to do so. On the shadow fleet, I completely concur we have some of the best capabilities in the world. There's much to be done. We have done a lot already, but there's more to do. I would say watch this space. And then on Qatar, I won't be drawn into comments on force posture, but what I can say is the safety and security of our forces is absolutely at the forefront of my mind during any period of instability. To bring me on to the comments to the honourable member of Romford, asking about the details of the deployment, from my perspective, and some of the conditions you put on us were almost as many as Putin would have put on the peacekeeping force itself. To talk about troop numbers, talk about rotations, talk about border policing, naval assets and jets at this point in time would give away too much information to our adversaries who are watching or individuals who perhaps aren't on these benches today. It's a really important matter that at the right time, right place and the right forum, the information is shared so we can unify the House and come up with the right political and military decisions to deliver the support to Ukraine that is required. Very quickly, yes please.
I welcome his summary of this. Would he commit to ensuring that every member outside of this place can have that information to help inform decisions as we go forward when the time is right? Without operational security breach.
Was provide the briefings at the appropriate levels. I would like to pay my thanks to the chair of the committee for Islington South and Finsbury. She highlights a really important point about hybrid warfare. This is important. There has been several comments about there is no border with Russia. Well, let me tell you, there may not be a border, but there is a front line. That front line sits in the North Atlantic, it sits in cyberspace, and it sits in influence space. And it has been breached every time, every day of every year. National Cybersecurity Centre has already said 20,000 attacks in 2024, 400 serious, 89 nationally serious. That costs the UK 15 billion every year. Hostile state activity against the MOD is up by 50%, and global instability at the start of this conflict increased food prices through fertiliser costs, inflation, the highest point in 45 years. What I would also like to say is one of the key lessons that many members have mentioned is resilience. The resilience of the Ukrainian people. And this is why we need to think about resilience here in our nation. Our country's security is not measured only by what it can deploy overseas, but what it can deny its adversaries at home. A society that can absorb shocks from pandemic, cyber attacks, economic disruption, corruption, and importantly disinformation leaves hostile state actors with far fewer options. Resilience is not a soft concept. It is a hard requirement of modern deterrence. I support Ukraine 110%. I know the House does. Briefings will come at the right time and the right place to deliver the right decision here in this House.
The question is that this House has considered the situation in Ukraine. As many as of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes